This is the story of the greatest expedition in history, a voyage that would take 180 men around the planet in a quest to uncover the last great secrets of geography. Its commander was a man named James Cook, the greatest British explorer of all time. What followed was one of the most ambitious journeys ever attempted by human beings, and one of the most dangerous. His crew would discover new lands, battle ferocious storms, and fight native warriors. Many would never return home. As a note, my main reference is a book by author Hampton Sides called The Wide, Wide Sea. It is fantastic and I highly recommend it. So let us begin and travel the globe with Captain James Cook. Welcome to the Great Explorers. In 1776, James Cook had sailed around the world twice and done more to fill in the blank spaces of the map than almost anyone in history. He was at the height of his fame. Politicians, wealthy merchants, and even the king praised his achievements. Yet that year, with nothing left to prove, Cook accepted the challenge of one last voyage. It would be his most ambitious and dangerous yet. But before we follow him on that final expedition, it's worth knowing how he got there, how a simple farm boy from the countryside rose to greatness. So here is some brief background on the man. James Cook was born in Yorkshire, England, in 1728. His father was a farm manager, and the family lived in a small mud and thatch hut. There was little money and little education. As a teenager, he moved to Whitby, a fishing town on the cold North Sea. He became an apprentice in the merchant navy, serving aboard ships that carried coal and timber between English ports. During this time, he learned not only how to sail and read the weather, but also the sciences of algebra, trigonometry, and astronomy, skills that would one day serve him as a captain. Then, at age 27, Cook made a surprising decision. He left the merchant trade, where he was on track for a well-paid career, and instead enlisted in the Royal Navy. This was a drastic decision, as it meant starting from scratch as an ordinary seaman. But James Cook wanted more from life. He yearned for adventure. At any rate, he proved himself quickly in the Navy. During the 7 Years' War in Canada, Cook earned a reputation as a brilliant mapmaker, producing charts that helped the British defeat the French. The Navy's commanders were impressed by his mathematical precision. To give you an idea of how skilled Cook was, one summer, he painstakingly mapped the island of Newfoundland, which has one of the most intricate coastlines in the world. His work was so accurate that his charts were still used by captains into the early 20th century. Here's Cook's map compared with modern satellite images. You can see just how accurate he was. Anyway, by the time Cook was 39 years old, the higher-ups in the Navy had recognised his value. They tasked him with 2 round-the-world voyages of exploration. He travelled to Tahiti, a tiny island in the Pacific Ocean, and explored vast amounts of the South Pacific, as well as the coasts of Australia and New Zealand, which were virtually unknown to Europeans. I can't explain how dangerous, but also how magical these voyages were. I mean, imagine being the first Europeans to discover Australia and setting foot on its shores. The men had no idea what they might find there, what animals, what people. By the way, Cook had many encounters with native Aboriginal people who had never been visited by anyone before, and who had no concept of Europe, or even what a sailing boat was. This often led to fascinating encounters, as you will see for yourself as we get going. If you're interested in what Cook was like as a person, here's a description. He was tall for the time, standing over 6'3", although he did have a small stoop from spending so much time in the cramped environment of the ship. He had a bad scar on his right hand from an accident that he had had in Canada, when a gunpowder horn he had been holding exploded. The incident could have killed him, and he often wore a glove on his right hand. He also didn't drink much, rare for a sailor, and never swore, although he did have a huge temper at times. When it came to exploring, Cook has been called a technician or a machine. He tried to make sailing a science. He prided himself on accuracy. Cook saw himself as an explorer-scientist, and he tried to view everything through an impartial lens. He did not believe in the common superstitions that most sailors held. We will talk more about this later on. As a side note, Cook's main mission for these first 2 voyages had been to search for a mysterious southern continent called Terra Australis. Scientists at the time thought that there must be a huge continent, far bigger than Australia, at the southern tip of the planet, in order to counterbalance the weight of all the landmass in the northern hemisphere. Without such a continent, it was thought that the world would be so top-heavy it would just tumble into space. So Cook had taken his ship further south than anyone had ever been, becoming the first captain to cross the Antarctic Circle. He even got within a few hundred miles of Antarctica itself before he had to flee from the ice as his ship began to freeze around him. It would be over another 100 years before explorers finally reached the shores of Antarctica. While Cook's explorations had proven that Antarctica existed, there was no gigantic mythical continent on the scale that had been thought. I mention this because this was an example of negative discovery, which is disproving something which is widely thought to be true. Cook thought that negative discovery was just as valuable as actually finding something real. Okay, finding a supercontinent would have been cool, but disproving it was just as important. Cook would later write, quote, "If I have failed in discovering a continent, it is because it does not exist, and not for want of looking," end quote. But anyway, in 1776, James Cook found himself at home in London, having returned from his second voyage, which had lasted 1,100 days and had taken him around the world and further south than anyone had ever been. This achievement had made him a celebrity. And at the age of 46, he had decided he was done with exploration. 46 wasn't old, but he had spent most of his life at sea. Long voyages had a way of aging the body before its time. The physical and mental stress of leading an expedition added up. Luckily, Cook had been offered a cushy job in London that paid him well and didn't demand much of his time. This was a way for the government to thank him for what he had done. If he wanted, Cook could have lived comfortably with minimal stress for the remainder of his life. However, Cook was an explorer at heart. Within a few months, it was clear he was having second thoughts. He wrote to a friend saying, quote, "My fate drives me from one extreme to the other. A few months ago, the whole southern hemisphere was hardly big enough for me, and now I'm going to be confined within the limits of London, which is far too small for an active mind like mine," end quote. His doubts about this new life heightened when it was announced that the Navy was planning a new expedition that would take the ship Cook had captained on his last voyage, the Resolution, into the Pacific once again. The thought of someone else captaining his ship and claiming the glory for work he had set the foundations for worked on his nerves. As much as he tried to deny it to himself, he missed the open sea. It wouldn't take Cook long to change his mind. The story goes that he was invited to a dinner party in London, along with other high-ranking members of the Navy. Well, at some point during all the talking, Cook got himself so fired up that he rose to his feet and announced that he would captain the expedition, much to everyone's surprise and excitement. Within a few days, Cook was once again preparing his ship, the Resolution, to set out into the unknown. The expedition had two main goals. Firstly, on board Cook's ship would be a young Tahitian man named Mai. On Cook's last expedition, his crew had visited the island of Tahiti, which is a tiny speck of land in the vastness of the Pacific. There they encountered Mai, who had begged the English to let him aboard their ship and bring him back to England. Cook and his fellow captain thought it would be an interesting cultural experiment to bring a native person from the other side of the planet to England, so they allowed him to come aboard. And well, when Cook finally returned to London, Mai became a public sensation. The newspapers ran stories on him, and the upper class in London were fascinated to meet this man who was so different to them. During his stay in England, Mai lived in country houses, mingled with the elite, and even met King George III. But now it was time to transport Mai back to his home in Tahiti, so he could tell his fellow islanders the wonders he had seen in England. In addition to transporting Mai home, Cook had been set another task by the king. He was to deliver a whole assortment of animals, from horses, cows, sheep, and goats, to Tahiti, so that the natives could start their own British-styled farms. It was an odd request, and also a major pain for Cook. Trying to keep cows and sheep alive in the bottom of his ship while sailing around the world would be quite the challenge. Just know that these animals will cause Cook immense frustration and pain on the upcoming journey. Now, the second and far more important goal of the expedition was to explore the unknown northwest coast of America, chart its geography, and locate the fabled Northwest Passage. If you don't know what the Northwest Passage is, let me explain it to you. For nearly 300 years, the Northwest Passage had been the holy grail for all explorers. It was thought to be a sea route that would connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, cutting right across North America. The reason why it was so important is because European countries were desperate to find a quicker trade route to Asia. If a country was to discover this mythical route, it would rewrite the balance of trade and make them extremely wealthy. So the race was on. It's worth knowing that in Cook's time, very little was actually known about the Arctic. One of the leading theories was that the North Pole itself was ice-free. It was thought that yes, while ice might cling to the coastlines of Greenland and Siberia, it was impossible for seawater in the deep ocean to freeze. If this was true, then in theory, you could just sail straight across the top of the world. Cook did not really buy this. He had seen the great ice fields in Antarctica in the south with his own eyes, and doubted the Arctic would be different. But he was willing to find out once and for all. Now, over the centuries, dozens of famous explorers had travelled into the icy waters of the Arctic in order to find the passage, but all had either perished or returned empty-handed. Most previous expeditions had approached from the east, navigating through the channels near Greenland. This time, however, the British Navy had a different plan. They wanted Cook to begin the search from the opposite side. Virtually nothing was known about this area of the world, and it would be a great opportunity for Cook to chart the land and search for the passage. Everyone was hoping that with Cook leading the expedition, maybe this time it would be different. The government had also announced a reward of £20,000 for the crew of any ship that located the passage. This would help entice sailors to sign up for such a dangerous voyage. A share of that prize could set them up for life. Finally, I will add here that while the two main goals of the expedition was to return Mai and find the passage, Cook also had some secret instructions he was ordered to fulfill along the way. Even the crew did not know what these were, as we will soon see. If you're enjoying this video, please feel free to subscribe or leave a comment. This video took a lot of time, so I'd really appreciate any feedback. Thank you, and let's get back to the story. So, for the first 6 months of 1776, Cook prepared his ship and crew for the upcoming adventure. I will tell you a little about both. The Resolution was a 3-masted ship, around 110 feet long. This was the ship Cook had captained on his last voyage, and he placed a lot of faith in the small vessel. The ship would carry over 100 men, including seasoned sailors, carpenters, cooks, blacksmiths, surgeons, and 20 marines for protection. Many of the crew had served on Cook's last 2 voyages, and here they were about to set out on another trip around the world. Countless supplies were loaded on board, casks of water, beer, wine and rum, as well as salted meats, hard biscuits and bread. Another ship was joining Cook's expedition, called the Discovery. It was slightly smaller than the Resolution, and would carry 67 men. It was to be captained by a man named Charles Clerk, an experienced officer who had accompanied Cook before. Cook thought of Charles Clerk as a brother, and had every faith in the man. The men were very different in their temperament. Clerk was 16 years younger than Cook, and was considered to be friendlier amongst the crew. Cook was the classic stern father figure, whereas Clerk was the fun uncle that would let them get away with a bit more. So, at last, on July 12th, 1776, Captain Cook and his crew of 112 sailors set sail from Plymouth, England. The second boat, the Discovery, was not yet ready to sail, but Cook had had enough of waiting. They would meet up later on. After setting out on the Resolution, Cook travelled south to the Canary Islands, just off the coast of Africa. He stayed for a few days, replenishing his supplies in Tenerife, before heading south to the nearby Cape Verde's Islands, where right away his ship almost met with disaster. While sailing at night, Cook failed to spot a shallow reef that they were heading straight towards. Luckily, a lookout alerted everyone of the danger at the last second, and Cook immediately ordered the ship to turn hard. The expedition's surgeon, a man named William Anderson, summed up the event by writing, quote, "For the space of 10 minutes, I thought it utterly impossible we should avoid striking on the rocks." End quote. It had been a very close call so early on in their journey. If the ship had hit the reef, there was no doubt in anyone's minds that all lives would have been lost. Cook did later write in his diary that, quote, "Our situation was very alarming," end quote. But many thought that this was an indication of a change in Cook's character. It was almost as if the great captain had become overconfident with his own abilities. Time and time again, Cook had tempted fate and ventured into the unknown, and time again, he had returned unscathed. Perhaps that had skewed his judgment, and he thought of himself as invincible. Many of the men thought it was madness to sail in such dangerous areas under the darkness of night. But Cook ordered them on, as if he knew something that no one else did. This brings us to a point I want to make about James Cook. Throughout his last voyage, many of the men report seeing a change in their captain. He was more serious, more cranky. He would administer punishment more frequently, and his tolerance for misbehaviour was very little. At times, he seemed fed up with life on the ship. We will see more evidence of this later on. After hanging around the Cape Verde's islands for a few days, Cook ordered the Resolution out into the Atlantic. The men marvelled at the sights that waited for them on the high seas. They watched meteors trace across the night sky and observed bioluminescent algae in the water that they had no explanation for. I think it's important to consider how exciting these voyages were for the men. In our modern lives, we don't really have anything that can compare to this level of adventure. They were quite literally casting off into the unknown. A few weeks later, they drew within 100 miles of the Brazilian coast before they caught easterly winds and were catapulted back across the Atlantic. They made incredible speed, and in October 1776, the men reached Cape Town in South Africa. Now, Cape Town at the time was known as the Tavern of the Seas. Almost every ship that passed around the African continent stopped there to replenish their supplies and rest. It was a hub of activity and trade. The men relished being off the ship and enjoyed themselves immensely. They took the opportunity to gorge themselves on fresh fruit and meat, which was not available at sea. One notable event occurred during their stay, which I will mention quickly. An armourer from Cook's ship got drunk in a tavern, and he paid for his drinks with some counterfeit coins. The tavern owner alerted the police, who then arrested him. The police boarded the Resolution and looked in the man's sea chest and found a device that was used to stamp the fraudulent coins. Cook had to order the man to be lashed brutally in order to appease the local police. Anyway, after a month in Cape Town, Cook was eager to get going. His ship had been repaired and the new livestock loaded. However, just as he was about to set off on November 10th, a small ship limped into the harbour. It was the Discovery, captained by Charles Clerke. Cook greeted his old friend, and they were pleased to be reunited. However, it meant Cook would now have to wait a bit longer so the Discovery could be repaired. By the way, the second ship had enjoyed a rather uneventful trip to Cape Town, although one young member of the crew, named George Harrison, had lost his life. One evening, he had fallen overboard and splashed into the sea. Clerke had instantly ordered a small boat to be launched to retrieve the man, but they never found him. This was strange, as he was said to have been a strong swimmer, and the boat had been instantly dispatched. The only conclusion the men could reach was that the sharks that trailed the ship had gotten to him first. He was the first member of the expedition to lose his life. Just as a note here before we get going, I will mention that Charles Clerke, the captain of the Discovery, was not well. In fact, he was suffering from the first stages of tuberculosis. Whether he knew what was wrong with him, we don't know, but he was starting to experience chills, sweats, and a persistent cough. He was only 30 years old and otherwise in good health, but soon one of the world's deadliest pathogens would take hold of him. On November 30th, the expedition, now 2 ships, set off. England would not receive any more news about either the Resolution or the Discovery for another 3 years. Now that we are underway, I just want to pause for a moment to talk about something that haunted expeditions like this, and that is scurvy. If you're not familiar, scurvy is a disease that plagued sailors for centuries. Between 1600 and 1800, it's estimated that 2 million European sailors died from scurvy. In fact, on any long voyage, it was almost assumed that over half the crew wouldn't make it back alive. The symptoms of scurvy were horrifying. At first, a man would feel weak and sluggish. Then his muscles and even his bones would begin to ache. His skin would crack and peel, and his gums would swell and bleed. Within months, death was certain. And for the longest time, no one had any idea how to stop it. That is, until James Cook came along. You see, on his first 2 voyages, something extraordinary happened. Not a single man under his command died of scurvy. Not one. For the 18th century, that was completely unheard of. It was a historic breakthrough. The true cause of scurvy, which is a lack of vitamin C, wouldn't actually be identified until the 1930s, nearly 170 years later. So what was Cook doing differently? Well, he was convinced it had to be related to diet. While most crews survived on little more than salted meat and biscuits, Cook was relentless about feeding his men fresh food whenever possible. They weren't happy about it. Sailors were notoriously fussy about their food, but he made sure fruits, vegetables and greens were consumed whenever they could be obtained. He didn't know exactly what food did the trick, but insisted on a varied diet, which meant at least some of them contained vitamin C. The results spoke for themselves. Cook had found a way to keep scurvy at bay. It is another achievement of the legendary explorer. Now, by mid-December, the ships ventured into the area of the Southern Ocean called the Roaring Forties. At those southern latitudes, the wind whips around the planet uninterrupted by any land, and therefore picks up ferocious speeds. The sea was rough, and the waves broke over the decks, soaking the crew. The temperature dropped, and the men found themselves shivering in their damp clothes. And it was not just the crew that suffered. In the hold, the animals fared even worse. Cows and sheep were not accustomed to living in such a harsh environment. They were continually battered by the heaving of the ship, and many became too weak to stand. But soon the crew encountered something more frightening than rough seas: fog. It enshrouded both ships, and the men could barely see 10 feet in front of them. It was unnerving for everyone. The greatest fear was that the two ships would collide, or worse, lose one another entirely. The crews fired guns every hour as signals so that they could locate each other and stay close. However, it wasn't long before Cook grew impatient with the slow progress. He ordered all sails raised and pushed the ships ahead at full speed. To several officers, this decision felt reckless. To them, it seemed as if Cook was gambling with their lives. There were no charts, no reliable bearings of this area. Cook appeared not to be relying on reason or experience, but on blind faith. The unease amongst the crew was heightened as none of the men actually knew what they were searching for in this part of the ocean. This is because Cook had secret instructions that he had not shared with anyone else. In truth, he was looking for a remote island called Kerguelen, which we now know today as Grande Terre. The French had discovered it a few years earlier, and Cook had been tasked with checking it out. It is one of the most remote places on Earth. There was also another reason for Cook's haste. The animals in the ship would not last much longer without fresh air and a break from the jolting seas. He needed to find land soon. A few days later, and the first signs began to appear. A penguin was seen swimming, and seaweed was spotted floating by. Then, out of the fog, the men heard the sound of waves crashing onto rocks. As impatient as Cook was, even he was not crazy enough to approach an island when he couldn't see. So he waited another day for the fog to lift, and then drew closer. What Cook saw made his heart sink. The island was desolate and barren. There wasn't a single tree in sight, nothing his carpenters could use to make repairs, and no wood for the men to build the bonfires they had dreamed of to warm their frozen bodies. Worse, there was no grass for his animals to eat, which they desperately needed. The one saving grace was that there was an abundance of fresh water, so the men could refill the great water casks that they relied on out at sea. This land was uninhabited by humans, but it was home to thousands of seals, sea lions, and birds. The men wasted no time clubbing the seals to death for food and taking their blubber to rend into oil for their lamps. The sea mammals on the island had never encountered humans, so they were completely unscared, allowing the men to just walk right up to them. They killed as many as they could until the holds of both ships were once again filled with food. After just 4 days on Grande Terre, Cook and his 2 ships set off once again. In his charts, Cook called the barren place the, quote, Island of Desolation, end quote. There had been no decent grazing for the animals on the island, so he had no choice but to keep going. He could not afford to linger. The 2 ships moved east through the fog in the direction of New Zealand. Cook had visited the island once before, and he knew that there he would find everything he needed to repair his ships and revitalize the animals. Again, the expedition moved forward at full sail, but the fog made it impossible for Cook to take proper observations. Without a clear view of the stars or the horizon, he had no reliable way to fix his position. Cook was pretty much just sailing blind, just using his compass. Then, on January 19th, a storm snapped the Resolution's foremast. They urgently needed to find somewhere to stop to repair the damages. Once again, some members of the crew wondered if Cook was pushing them too hard. But it was then, a few days later, that the fog finally lifted, and the lookout cried out that land was in sight. It was believed to be an island first charted by a Dutch explorer called Abel Tasman. Today, you probably know it as the island of Tasmania. 2 days later, both ships limped into a sheltered bay. To the men, it looked like paradise. There were white beaches with blue emerald water, surrounded by hills covered in forests. I want to stress here that Cook was the second European to ever set foot in this mysterious place. What a magical experience that must have been. The men wasted no time and quickly rowed ashore. They collected wood and noted the abundance of animals. They saw sharks, stingrays, crabs and shellfish in the blue water. In the forests, they saw snakes, lizards and scorpions. The eucalyptus trees were enormous, with one lieutenant remarking that they, quote, grow to astonishing height and size and exceed everything we have ever seen, end quote. However, of more interest was the sight of smoke rising up into the sky from the nearby hills. This meant humans lived here, humans that had never encountered outsiders ever before, and soon Cook's men discovered signs of their activity. They found eucalyptus trees that had had their enormous trunks hollowed out by fire, making a kind of shelter. The men were enchanted by the idea that these people lived in the trunks of giant trees. As they walked into the forest, Cook sensed these strangers were watching them. He ordered his men to be alert. And not before long, a group of 8 natives appeared. They were naked and had patterns cut into their skin. Both groups looked at each other warily. This was almost certainly the first time these native people had ever seen outside humans. Cook later recounted the event, writing, quote, they approached us from the woods, without betraying any marks of fear, with the greatest confidence imaginable. None of them had weapons, except for the one who carried a pointed stick. They received every present we made without the least appearance of satisfaction. They seemed to set no value on iron or iron tools. When some bread was given and they understood it was to be eaten, they threw it away without even tasting it. End quote. Mai, the Tahitian man, stepped forward and tried speaking to the natives in his Polynesian tongue, but it was no use. Neither party could understand a word of each other. Cook decided to offer them a male and female pig from his ship as a gift. He hoped that they would reproduce and perhaps give these people a new source of food. The natives were amazed by the animals. However, they didn't seem to grasp Cook's concept of breeding. They seemed to want to kill them straight away, much to Cook's frustration. It was then that Mai decided to show them what an English firearm could do. When Cook had first visited Tahiti and demonstrated modern firepower to Mai's people, they had been shocked, and it was clear he was eager to give these natives the same experience. He fired a rifle, and when the shot rang out, the natives froze. It astonished them and frightened them to their core. They dropped all the gifts Cook had given them and ran off into the forest. The Englishmen called out for them to come back, but they would not return. And so that was the first encounter between 2 different races of human beings. It ended in a gunshot. Sounds about right, really. Anyway, the next morning, it appeared the natives, who by the way were called the Palawa, appeared to have regained their confidence. They were waiting on the beach, clearly hoping to meet these strange men again. Cook went out with his crew and began to interact with them. He had no weapon with him and walked around them without fear. This is one of the qualities we can admire in Cook. He was very curious about different cultures and people, and he also trusted his ability to make peace with fellow human beings, no matter how different their experiences of life were. After a while, a group of Aboriginal women made their way onto the beach. As you can imagine, it wasn't long before some of Cook's crew tried to advance on them. After all, the men had been deprived of sex for months. In fact, one of the reasons the crew had signed on for the expedition was the promise of sex in faraway places. On Cook's last expedition, he had stopped in Tahiti, where sex could be had for the price of a nail. Sailors had returned to England speaking of this tropical paradise where sex was plentiful. Now you can imagine why so many sailors were so keen to sign up on an expedition that was so inherently dangerous. Anyway, for whatever reason, these native women were very different to those found in Tahiti. They completely rejected Cook's men. And I don't really think we can blame them. Let's remember, these sailors had rotten teeth, blistered skin, and calloused bodies. Many of them would have been suffering from syphilis or other venereal diseases. They wouldn't have been the most attractive sight. After a while, it was clear the Palawa women were getting annoyed, so one of the elders ordered them away to stop Cook's men from trying. Cook, by the way, was said to never indulge in sex with any of the native people he visited, and he continually raged at his men for not being able to control their desires. To his credit, he actually wanted to protect these native people from the sexual diseases his men carried. In Tahiti, he had witnessed the spread of venereal disease and thought it was one of the worst outcomes from his visit with them. He was strict with his men and anyone caught disobeying him would be punished. After interacting with the natives here, Cook quickly came to admire them. They lived a simple life, free from material desire. He wrote, quote, "They live in a tranquility which is not disturbed by inequality. The earth and sea furnishes them with all things necessary for life. They do not desire magnificent houses or household stuff." End quote. In total, Cook spent 4 days at this place he called Adventure Bay. After the repairs to the Resolution were made, he thought it would be smart to move on. He didn't want to stay and risk the chance of a misunderstanding occurring, which often happened when interacting with other cultures. On January 30th, 1777, the two ships weighed anchor and left Tasmania in the direction of New Zealand. In doing so, they entered the largest body of water on Earth, the Pacific. Before we continue, I just want to tell you a little bit about the Pacific Ocean, because to be honest, it is insane. The Pacific is the largest ocean on Earth, covering more than 63 million square miles. That's more than 1/3 of the planet's surface. To put it in perspective, you could fit all of the continents into the Pacific and still have room to spare. Its deepest point, the Mariana Trench, drops nearly 36,000 feet, deeper than Mount Everest is tall. Most of the Pacific is so empty that if you dropped a ship into the middle, it could sail for weeks or maybe even months without seeing land. This is what Cook and the men were contending with. The scale of the ocean was just beyond their comprehension. If you're enjoying this video, please feel free to subscribe or leave a comment. This video took a lot of time, so I'd really appreciate any feedback. Thank you, and let's get back to the story. It wasn't long before the men wished they were back on that tranquil beach. Out on the open Pacific, the weather worsened, and they faced torrential rain and thick fog. On February 6th, tragedy struck. A young Marine named George Moody on the Discovery fell overboard in the darkness and was never seen again. Other members of the crew suspected he had been drunk, but didn't know for sure. Anyway, it was a bad omen at a time when the health of the Discovery's captain, Charles Clerk, was only worsening as his body slowly succumbed to tuberculosis. The morale of the crew wasn't helped by the fact once again no one knew exactly why they were heading to New Zealand. Like Kerguelen, Cook was keeping it a secret. Now, the real reason was that Cook had unfinished business in New Zealand, which brings us to a little side note. On his previous expedition around the world, Cook had been separated from his second ship called the Adventure during a bad storm. The Adventure was captained by a man called Toby Fenneau, and to escape the storm, Fenneau took shelter in a quiet bay on New Zealand's South Island. Cook had visited the place a few months prior and reported that it was a good spot. There was food and fresh water available. And although it was populated by natives, the famous Maori, Cook had found them to be mostly friendly. However, when the Adventure arrived, the vibe was different. The Maori were impatient and rude. They did not seem happy to see another European ship again so soon. It was not long before the natives started stealing from the ship and getting into arguments with the crew. As tensions heightened, Fenneau realized they needed to leave. As the crew prepared to set sail, the captain dispatched 10 men to sail across the bay to a place where wild celery was known to grow. It would be useful on the upcoming journey to battle scurvy. However, by nightfall, the 10 men had not returned, and the next morning there was still no sign of them. A rescue team was then dispatched, and they searched the area. What they found shocked everyone to their core. Along the beach, just past the point where the celery grew, they found the scene of a massacre. Scattered along the sand were the remains of human body parts, severed heads, hearts, and lungs, all glistening in the sun. There was roasted meat on glowing coals, still warm to the touch. It did not take long for the rescue team to identify the remains of all 10 men who had gone to collect the celery. For some reason, the Maori had butchered the men. This was the first time the English had been prey to violence from the natives. The rescue team scooped up some of the remains and quickly retreated back to the ship for safety. They showed Fenneau the remains and his face went pale. Some of his men called for retaliation, but in the end the captain decided it would be pointless. They departed the bay the next morning, eager to be away. When news eventually reached England of the tragedy, the newspapers ran with it. 10 brave English sailors slaughtered and eaten by cannibals. It was quite the story. And so that was the reason Cook was now setting sail for New Zealand. He felt that the event demanded an inquiry. After all, even though Cook himself hadn't been there, they had technically been men under his command. To be honest, privately, Cook was not that surprised by the event. He knew that the Maori practiced cannibalism from time to time, and they would defend their land if they felt threatened. If anything, he was secretly of the opinion that the Englishmen must have done something stupid to provoke the Maori. Speaking of the natives, he wrote, quote, "I've always found them of a brave, noble disposition, but they are a people that will never put up with an insult if they have an opportunity to resent it." End quote. The crew sighted New Zealand's South Island on February 10th, 1777. But before we continue, I want to tell you a little bit about New Zealand, because it is absolutely fascinating. I hope you don't get bored of these small lessons. For tens of millions of years, New Zealand was cut off from the rest of the world. This isolation gave it an evolutionary history unlike anywhere else on Earth. Strange and wonderful creatures evolved there, like the giant weta, which is the world's largest insect, and the colossal freshwater eel, which can grow up to 6 feet long. New Zealand was also the last major habitable landmass on Earth to be settled by humans, and the final island reached by the great Polynesian explorers. It wasn't until around 800 years ago that explorers from Polynesia first arrived on its shores. And by the way, that is a story that is so interesting, I plan on making a future video about it. Most people still don't know this, but those early Polynesian explorers sailed more than 2,000 miles across the open Pacific in just double-hulled canoes. No one knows exactly what drove them to make such a bold and unbelievable journey, but they did. And those early settlers successfully reached New Zealand and would later on become the Maori. Another interesting fact about New Zealand is that until people arrived, bringing rats and dogs, there were no large mammals of any kind. This meant that bird species flourished there more than anywhere else on Earth. This includes the Haast eagle, which is one of the largest raptors to have ever existed on Earth, as well as the giant moa, which was a 12-foot tall ostrich-like bird. Sorry for that little side note, but I thought it was worth mentioning. Let's get back to the story. On February 12th, Cook reached Ship Cove, the site of the massacre, and dropped anchor. Maori canoes came out to check out the ships, and Cook recognized some of the natives from his previous visit. However, instead of welcoming him like an old friend, they kept their distance and appeared to be a little afraid. Cook tried to entice them on board by showing them gifts, but they wouldn't have it. Even when Mai, who spoke their Polynesian language, conveyed that they came in peace, the Maori didn't believe him. They kept their distance and sang songs of peace while waving white cloth. It appeared that they thought Cook had returned to avenge the murders. In the eyes of the crew, this made the Maori look completely guilty of the massacre, and some wanted revenge. However, Cook would not allow it. He wanted to know more. In any case, Cook's men began to set up camp on the beach. They hauled supplies across on boats and set up tents. The astronomers and blacksmiths set up their stations, much to the amazement of the Maori. They had never seen anything like it. And once the cows and horses were ferried across, the Maori couldn't contain their excitement. They had never seen such animals before. Slowly they began to come over and mingle with the crew. By the afternoon, word had gotten out around the area, and hundreds of Maori arrived. Many of them carried portable huts with them and set up a village right beside the English camp. That evening, the mood was like a festival or carnival, with both sides enjoying themselves. The Maori demonstrated their infamous haka dance, much to the alarm of the crew. The sailors were fascinated by the tattoos that covered every inch of the Maori flesh, and it is said that a few of the crew sought out the tattoo artists and volunteered themselves. A lieutenant named John Ledyard mentioned that one young sailor from the Discovery, quote, submitted himself to be tattooed from head to foot, end quote. Interestingly, the Maori were crazy for the blubber some of the sailors were boiling down from the butchered sea lions. The Maori struggled to get enough fat in their diet, and they seemed to have an insatiable desire for blubber. They even ate any wax candles the crew left laying around. The festivities went on long into the night, but when eventually the crew tried to sleep, they were awoken by ominous shouts and screams from different parts of the cove. The crew could not discern who was making these noises, but one sailor remarked, quote, "We sometimes thought that some miserable wretches were being put to death," end quote. However, when the men awoke, everything seemed well, so the crew began to make repairs to both ships. It was then that Cook met with a Maori chief called Kahura. Through talking with him, Cook began to get an impression of what had happened the day of the massacre. The chief said he had been there, and it had started when one of the Maori people had stolen bread from the sailors, which caused one of the Marines to overreact and shoot him. As tensions heightened, the Marine then shot another Maori dead, and well, that started the fire. The Maori warriors quickly overpowered the sailors and clubbed them to death. To Cook, it seemed clear that this had not been a premeditated attack, but instead had just been a misunderstanding that turned deadly. If anything, he felt that the Marine who had first shot was largely at fault. As for the cannibalism, Cook saw no real point in getting upset by it. He knew that the Maori practiced the gruesome ritual, so he was not surprised. The next day, it seemed that the attitude of the Maori had changed. They were more confident when dealing with the English, and were more forceful in their bargaining. Many of the crew believed it was because they were now confident there would be no retaliation for the murders. Because of this, they seemed to hold the strangers in contempt. They thought the English were weak not to retaliate. One of the crew members wrote that the Maori were, quote, now confident of their own power, end quote. As Cook began preparations to leave the cove, the Maori chief Kahura was even bold enough to board the Resolution, showing zero fear. To many of the crew, the chief's mere presence on the ship was an act of war. After all, this man had killed, butchered, and even eaten some of their former crewmates. Mai, the Tahitian man in particular, begged the captain to allow him to shoot the chief. However, Cook, to the astonishment of the entire crew, invited Kahura into his private cabin. Mai was furious and said, quote, why don't you kill him? If a man kills another in England, he is hanged for it. This man killed 10, and yet you will not kill him, end quote. Cook listened to the anger of the crew, but ultimately did nothing. He later wrote, quote, Mai's arguments, though reasonable enough, had no weight with me, end quote. In Cook's mind, the natives just had an entirely different conception of life and different societal norms compared to the Europeans. He had not been present at the massacre, and he didn't know whose fault it was. Revenge would serve little purpose. To round off the interaction, while sitting in Cook's cabin, the Maori chief noticed a painting that the expedition's artist had painted of a random Maori man. Kahura was amazed by it, and considering he was a chief, he felt he deserved to have one himself. Well, Cook sent for the artist, a man named John Webber, and this is the painting we have from that exact moment of Kahura, the Maori chief. I find it so cool that we have images like this that can really bring the story to life. Anyway, after 2 weeks in the cove, Cook decided it was time to leave. On February 25th, the crew exchanged farewells with the Maori and cast off again into the Pacific. A month later, they reached the Friendly Islands, what we now call Tonga. This stop had not been part of Cook's plan, but a storm had blown them west, and so Tonga it was. The expedition spent the next 2.5 months in the Tongan Islands, enjoying the plentiful food provided by the natives. However, this is where we start to see a change in James Cook. The captain had always strived to be understanding of native people and their different customs. For example, many islanders had no concept of private property, and therefore didn't think twice about stealing items from the ship. While this was often very inconvenient and annoying, Cook rarely ordered any punishment on the perpetrators, instead just making sure items were returned. But in Tonga, Cook began to get more frustrated and severe in his treatment of the natives. It wasn't long before islanders caught stealing were tied to a tree and lashed, and not just once or twice, but dozens of times. Then, Cook approved cutting off the ears of thieves and beating them with oars. This sudden change in behaviour alarmed many members of the crew. They had no desire to punish these happy and tranquil people. Often the islanders had no idea they were even doing anything wrong. The officers were concerned to see this sudden change in their captain, who for the longest time had shown fairness and restraint. So what could have caused this change in Cook's mindset? Well, historians have discussed this topic repeatedly over the centuries, and the truth is, we don't really know. Some people speculate that Cook was suffering from an illness or chronic pain. Others think he might have been racked with anxiety, or perhaps a vitamin D deficiency that was affecting him psychologically. And yet other people think maybe he'd just grown into a bit of a jerk with age, that he was believing his own legend. As I said, we don't really know. We'll leave it there for now, but just know that Cook will be susceptible to random acts of violence from this time onwards. Let's keep going. Cook departed the Friendly Islands, that were no longer that friendly, in July 1777. A few weeks later, the expedition finally reached Tahiti, the first major goal. Mai, the Tahitian man who had travelled around the world to England, was now almost home, and he was overcome by emotion as he approached his homeland. He'd been away for 4 years, and had travelled more than any of his fellow countrymen in history. Mai had been born at the lower end of the Tahitian class system, and he was hoping that with this experience, he would be received as a hero. King George had instructed Cook to give Mai a whole chestload of trinkets from England, which included a full set of shining armour and a whole assortment of guns and weapons, which should further inflate his standing in Tahitian society. The Resolution and Discovery pulled into a sheltered bay. Tahitian paddlers ventured out to the ship and greeted the crew. When they heard Cook was their captain, they were ecstatic. Cook was a legend on Tahiti, having visited the island twice before on his previous expeditions. The Tahitians climbed aboard, but they barely acknowledged Mai. They did not seem surprised to see one of their countrymen on the ship. In fact, they seemed to ignore him. However, this changed when Mai showed them a collection of red feathers he had obtained in Tonga. The Tahitians were mind blown. It was as if Mai was offering them a chest of gold. The natives went wild for the red feathers and were suddenly fawning over Mai as if he was their best friend. It turns out that red feathers were more precious on Tahiti than anything else, more so than even the iron tools that native people often desired. This is because for them, red feathers were an emblem of fertility and power. Mai didn't seem to care that the red feathers had completely changed their attitude towards him. However, this wasn't lost on Cook, who would later write, quote, "It was evident to everyone that it was not the man, but his property they were in love with." End quote. Cook prepared to move on as he wanted to visit different areas of Tahiti. However, before they set off, he had an important matter to raise with his crew. It was related to the men's daily allowance of grog. If you don't know what grog is, it was a mixture of rum and water that the sailors were allowed daily, and it was their most prized possession. If you wanted a happy crew, you did not mess with their allowance of grog. Otherwise, you might have a mutiny on your hands. However, Cook gathered his men and proposed that they should give up their ration of grog entirely. The crew couldn't believe what they were hearing. Give up their grog? They would rather die. But Cook explained his thinking and for the first time revealed their final goal. They were to sail to the top of North America into the frozen waters of the Arctic in search of the Northwest Passage. But there was a problem. Their supply of grog would never last the entire journey. So Cook laid out a choice. They could drink their rum now, but face the bitter cold of the Arctic with nothing to warm them, or they could go without the alcohol for the foreseeable, knowing that the grog would be waiting for them in the frozen north. To Cook's surprise, the men agreed without protest. Every sailor voted to save the grog for later. Now, for two of the men, the prospect of venturing into the Arctic had far bigger consequences than just their alcohol allowance. Charles Clerk, the captain of the Discovery, was now suffering badly from tuberculosis, and the ship's surgeon, a man named William Anderson, also had the disease and was faring even worse. They were both young men, in their 20s and 30s, so it was quite the tragedy. They were well aware that the Arctic would kill them both, so they came up with an idea. They would ask Cook if they could stay on Tahiti forever. At least then they could spend their last days in a paradise. They just needed to find the right moment to tell Cook of their intentions, but we'll get back to that. On August 23rd, the two ships moved to another bay around the island. Cook planned to stay there for at least a few weeks in order to rest the crew. For many of the men, the chance to visit Tahiti had been the main reason they'd signed up for the voyage. Cook thought it was only right they were free to enjoy it. It didn't take long before canoes packed with Tahitian women paddled out to the ships. The crew couldn't believe their luck. The stories they'd heard in England were true. One sailor would later write, quote, "They flocked to us. It was the happiest time I ever spent." End quote. By the way, there's been lots of debate as to what was going on here. Why were the Tahitian women so keen to have sex with the rough and ugly sailors? Some historians have suggested that the native women were just bored with the day-to-day life on the island, and the English were something new and something exotic. Another theory is that white pale skin was a sign of higher status in Tahitian society. Perhaps low-born women thought that by fornicating with Cook's men, they would garner some of that prestige, or at least any resulting children would. The simplest answer may be that the exchange of sex for an iron nail or metal tool was simply worth it for them. Whatever the case, that afternoon, women overran the ship entirely. John Ledyard, the lieutenant, wrote that, quote, "The ship was so crowded and confused that we could attend to no duty the remaining part of the day." End quote. While the men enjoyed themselves, Cook met a chief named Tu, who was effectively the king of Tahiti. Cook offered Chief Tu a series of gifts, hoping to win his favour. Cook's goal was simple: secure Mai's place so he could live undisturbed once they departed. But the chief showed little interest in Mai. To him, Mai was just another young man with no lineage or standing, and even the backing of the English did nothing to change that. During their talks, Tu revealed that he was preparing to attack a neighbouring island. Warfare between the islands was common, but to ensure victory this time, Tu had ordered a special ceremony at a Tahitian temple. It would involve a human sacrifice, and he invited Cook to witness it. Cook, who had never witnessed a human sacrifice before, was keen to go. The captain was ever fascinated by strange rituals conducted by different cultures. He took 3 men with him, including Mai and the expedition's artist, to document the event. At the temple, they were met with a grim scene. There was a mound of human skulls, and Cook counted 49 in total. The smell of blood and decay lingered in the air, and they saw that 2 pigs and 2 dogs had already been slain. Fortunately, it was revealed that the poor man who was to be sacrificed was already dead. He'd been hit in the head with a rock and killed a few hours earlier. Cook inquired as to who the man was, but apparently he was just a poor man that basically couldn't put up a fight and that no one cared for, so he'd made an easy victim. The ritual began, and a priest gouged out the man's eye and fed it to Chief Tu. His hair was cut off and offered to the gods. Anderson, one of Cook's men, was horrified, later writing that the practice was, quote, "born of the grossest ignorance and superstition," end quote. When it ended, a priest turned to Cook and asked if he had enjoyed the spectacle. Cook had watched the entire thing intently, but he spoke against it, warning that their gods would surely be angered for such cruelty. The priest felt a little bit insulted that Cook and his men had failed to appreciate the ritual. Now, one huge advantage of being in Tahiti was that Cook could finally unload the animals he had hauled across the world, the creatures that had caused him endless frustration so far. He decided to leave Chief Tu the majority of the livestock. The chief was very pleased, as many of these life forms were new to him. He also seemed to grasp the concept that these animals were to be bred and not killed straight away, which pleased Cook. The captain's relief to be rid of them cannot be understated. He wrote, quote, "Now I find myself lightened of a very heavy burden. The trouble and vexation that attended bringing these animals this far is hardly to be conceived," end quote. Now, after spending a few weeks in Tahiti, Cook only had one issue to contend with: what to do with Mai. It was becoming clear to everyone that the young man was not going to be welcomed back by his fellow islanders. Mai strode around, acting as if he was special or superior to the other Tahitians. He would flaunt his riches, but instead of earning their respect, he only got their envy. On one occasion, Mai wanted to show the islanders that he could ride a horse. And well, he put on a full suit of shining armour and rode up and down the beach, firing his pistol into the air. One of the sailors wrote, quote, "He looked like St. George going to fight the dragon," end quote. The islanders were a little impressed, but also just a bit bewildered. They didn't know how to react to someone like Mai, who had seen so much more than them. Where did he now fit in their society? I like this image of Mai riding along the beach in his armour, because it just must have looked so out of place to the Tahitians. Getting increasingly desperate, Cook decided to ensure Mai's future in Tahiti by proposing that he marry one of Chief Tu's sisters. It was a good idea. The only problem was that Mai didn't like Tu's sister. He immediately rejected the woman. Cook was enraged at Mai's dismissal. After all, he was only trying to help the young man. But Mai wouldn't budge. He did not want to marry. All of this led Cook to conclude that he couldn't leave Mai on Tahiti after all. He would have to go to another island nearby to find him a suitable home. And in truth, it was time to depart anyway. After only a month ashore, Relations with the Tahitians were beginning to sour, the bartering had grown tense, and Cook observed wild distortions in value. Red feathers were suddenly treasured beyond measure, while practical items like metal tools were dismissed as worthless. Once again, Cook wondered if their presence really brought any long-term benefit to the islanders. More often than not, it seemed that they left behind not knowledge or progress, but only a craving for possessions and materialism that made the native people unhappy. To emphasize this point, as the expedition was preparing to leave, Chief Tu begged Cook to have the English carpenters construct a box that could hold all his new belongings. He wanted somewhere safe to store his treasures. Cook agreed, and the carpenters set to work. They built a huge box, and Tu urged them to make them big enough so 2 guards could lay on top of it, and according to some later accounts, he sometimes slept inside the box himself so he could be surrounded by all his possessions. Now we are almost done with this little episode in Tahiti and the surrounding islands, but before we move on to the Northwest Passage, there's just one more notable event we should mention. The next stop for the expedition was the island of Moorea, just a 12-mile trip across the sea from Tahiti. The 2 ships soon passed through the outer reef of the island, and the men were struck by the sight before them. The water was emerald blue, and fierce mountains towered above them. The men were ecstatic, as they had not expected the island to match Tahiti's beauty. Once again, they found themselves in paradise. On shore, natives began to crowd on the beach. Many of them had never seen Europeans before. Cook chose to anchor 30 yards offshore, but not for safety. He had another idea. The Resolution was overrun with rats, and he hoped to get rid of them. A rope was tied from ship to shore, and before long the men watched with satisfaction as the unwanted guests scurried across the land. But what Cook didn't realise was the scale of what he'd just set in motion. The black rat, which is native to Europe, but unknown in this part of the Pacific, is among the most destructive invasive species in the world. Within years, their numbers would explode, spreading across the islands and devastating native plants and birds. In trying to solve a simple nuisance aboard his ship, Cook had unknowingly unleashed an ecological disaster. Anyway, Cook soon met the chief of Moorea, and the chief spied a goat on board Cook's ship and indicated that he would very much like to have one. The man had never seen a goat before, but Cook denied him. He only had a few animals left and intended on keeping them. The chief was very disappointed, as he had probably heard that Cook had given Chief Tu on Tahiti a lot of animals, so he thought the captain was being unfair. I mention this because it starts off quite a horrifying series of events. The next day, one of the goats disappeared. It had been grazing on the beach, but vanished into thin air. Well, Cook instantly blamed the chief and was insistent that the goat must be returned. And well, a few hours later, the goat was returned by an islander, who was then put in chains. However, while this was happening, another goat disappeared. Cook sent 2 men out to search the island and retrieve it, but when they returned empty-handed, Cook exploded. He decided to punish the islanders and send a clear message that thievery would not be tolerated. He wouldn't outright harm them physically, but instead he chose to destroy their possessions. On October 9th, 1777, Cook mustered 35 men and advanced on a small settlement. Word of his approach spread quickly, and most of the villagers had already fled into the hills, terrified of what was coming. Those who remained insisted they knew nothing of the missing goat, and well, that did not please Cook. He ordered every house to be torched and for their crops to be destroyed. And that was just the beginning. Cook spread the word that any native canoes were to be destroyed on sight. It's difficult to overstate the canoe's importance in Polynesian culture. It was more than just a boat, it was their livelihood and their source of food. Crafting one required enormous skill, time and effort, which made each vessel a treasured possession. But Cook would not be denied. He sent another message to the chief, saying if the goat was not returned, he would burn literally everything on the island. On the 3rd day of conflict, the goat was finally returned in good health. There was never any conclusion as to who'd stolen the animal, but Cook still blamed the chief. This is perhaps the most confusing and unexplainable event in Cook's long career, and if you're wondering what the crew thought about this episode, many were in shock and disturbed by the captain's actions. One sailor felt sure that, quote, less destructive measures might have been adopted and the same end gained, and that the islanders, quote, may fear us but never love us again, end quote. By the way, Mai was the driving force behind the chaos. He led the raids on the villages and even asked Cook for permission to fire on the fleeing natives. Many of the sailors wondered how he could treat his own people so cruelly. Another supporter of Cook's actions was Charles Clerke, the captain of the Discovery. Whether he backed Cook out of loyalty or personal conviction is unclear, but Clerke believed that Cook had only resorted to extreme measures after every gentle method had been tried. In any case, the episode was disturbing and out of character. On earlier voyages, Cook had never displayed such unrestrained cruelty towards native people. Again, historians have debated what might have caused this sudden change. Many speculate that a medical issue might have been affecting his judgment. The truth is, we'll just never know, but I will point out that Cook himself seemed to have regretted his actions, which had spiraled beyond his control. After leaving the island, he admitted in his diary, quote, "This troublesome and rather unfortunate affair ended, which could not be more regretted on the part of the natives than it was on mine," end quote. If you're enjoying this video, please feel free to subscribe or leave a comment. This video took a lot of time, so I'd really appreciate any feedback. Thank you, and let's get back to the story. Now, the time had finally come to find a home for Mai. Cook chose the island of Huahina, a lush mountainous place covered in thick forests. He had been the first European to land there years before, and believed it was perfect for Mai. The people of Huahina were less sophisticated than the Tahitians, and Cook hoped that Mai's English wealth would guarantee him both power and protection. It took just one day's sailing to reach the island, and on a wide beach, Cook selected a plot of land and ordered a house to be built, a proper English-style home. The carpenters came ashore with their tools and soon got to work. Cook's one instruction was that they should avoid using nails where possible, as the natives prized the iron above all else. Cook was scared that if nails were used, the house would likely just be torn apart by the natives' sheer desire for the metal. Instead, the carpenters had to build it entirely with wooden pegs and joints. Another necessity was a sturdy front door, which would have a lock and key in order to prevent any theft. As the construction was underway, the crew began to enjoy themselves again, and on October 22nd, hundreds of natives came to the beach and put on a festival. However, in the middle of the feasting and dancing, Cook suddenly appeared and stormed into the gathering, red in the face with rage. He announced that the sextant had been stolen. If you don't know, a sextant is a tool that was essential for navigation. Without it, the whole voyage was in jeopardy, and Cook was determined to recover it at any cost. Cook ordered Mai to find the thief, and within minutes he did. The culprit was just standing calmly among the crowd, apparently unbothered by his actions. Cook had the man hauled aboard the Resolution and put in chains. Mai interrogated him, and the thief revealed where he'd hidden the sextant, which was quickly retrieved. But the captain was not in a forgiving mood. The following day, the islander was put on trial and sentenced. The result was that his hair and eyebrows were shaved off in humiliation. The islanders valued their long hair, so this was a meaningful penalty. But then, to the surprise of his men, Cook demanded an even harsher punishment. He declared the man's ears were to be cut off. The thief was distraught and swore he would get revenge on Mai. It was quite a brutal scene. After the deed was done, the man was pushed overboard, forced to swim back to shore, with blood pouring from the holes in his head. He shouted in anger and pain the whole way back. As soon as he got to shore, he went to Mai's garden and tore up the crops and released the penned animals. He was serious about talk of his revenge. It was clear to Cook that something drastic would have to be done with the man. He was recaptured and taken aboard the Resolution before receiving a brutal flogging. The skin on his back was shredded to pieces. But that night, the man managed to break free from his chains and escape the ship. Cook was furious with the guards for allowing his escape, and the man was last seen trying to set Mai's house on fire before running off into the interior of the island, far away from the English. Knowing that Mai now at least had one enemy for life on the island did little to settle Cook's nerves about his friend's future. But in the following days, the house began to take shape. On October 26th, the finishing touches were made, including a Latin carving over the front door. which meant that the occupant of the house was under the protection of the King of England. Finally, the day came for Cook and the crew to say goodbye to Mai. Many of the men were going to miss the Tahitian man, who they had formed a strong bond with. Cook feared for Mai's future, but to try and prevent mishaps from occurring, he spoke to the chiefs on the island and made it clear that if anything happened to Mai, he would return and lay waste to the entire island. So on November 2nd, 1777, Mai boarded the Resolution for the last time and said his goodbyes. He kept his emotions in check, that is, until he came to Cook. Mai hugged the captain and wept uncontrollably. He was still crying when he stood on the beach, watching the ships sail away. Cook saluted him with a blast of 5 guns, and then they left Mai forever on the small island with his new home. I will let you know what became of Mai at the end of this video, but now that he had been successfully dropped off, Cook was free to pursue the true purpose of the expedition, to search for the mythical Northwest Passage. In the minds of Cook and the crew, they were now sailing into a blue void, the most empty place in the entire world, the heart of the Pacific. It would be 5,000 miles before they saw land again. The crew were heartbroken to be leaving the paradise of the Society Islands. In their minds, the best part of the journey was now over. All that awaited them onwards was the freezing waters of the Arctic. 2 of the men felt this sentiment more than anyone. Remember how Charles Clerk and William Anderson, the 2 men suffering from tuberculosis, had decided to stay in Tahiti forever? Well, for whatever reason, they never ended up following through with their plan. Perhaps they just couldn't bring themselves to abandon Cook and the expedition. Whatever the case, both men were now headed for the Arctic, and in their minds, to their certain death. For weeks, the expedition pushed on through the Pacific. The crew were lulled by the repetitiveness of daily life. But then, on December 23rd, 1777, something strange happened. A lookout spotted land ahead. Now, land is a generous term. What the expedition had stumbled on was a low coral island called an atoll. In fact, this was the largest atoll in the world, and Cook named it Christmas Island, now known as Kiritimati. The island appeared uninhabited, which was no surprise as it was barren and treeless. By the way, just as a side note, the British and US conducted nuclear weapon tests on Kiritimati in the 1950s and 60s, which led to partial destruction of the atoll. I just thought that was interesting. Anyway, the outer reef near this speck of land was brutal, and Cook could find no way through for the larger ships. He decided to anchor outside the reef and dispatch small boats. Eager to resupply, Cook sent men out to search for any drinkable fresh water, but they were out of luck. The island was bone dry. While the land itself did not offer much, the marine life in the shallows flourished. Sailors were dispatched armed with long pikes to catch fish, although they had to battle with sharks in order to get anything. One sailor wrote, quote, "On every side of us swam sharks innumerable, so voracious that they bit our oars and rudder, and I actually struck my sword into the back of one while we had the rudder in his teeth." End quote. As well as hunting fish, the men found hundreds of sea turtles. The island was a haven for the gentle creatures. Some of the turtles weighed up to 250 pounds and could live up to 70 years. The men snuck up on them at night and turned them upside down so they couldn't move. Then they'd return in the morning to haul them away. While out hunting, 2 of the men got separated from the others and ended up hopelessly lost for several days. They had a horrific time, being burnt by the sun, plagued by insects, and slowly dying of dehydration as they found no water. In fact, as their thirst worsened, they killed some turtles and drank their blood, but it just made them sick. Cook and Clerk were perplexed as to what could have happened to the 2 missing men. Perhaps there were natives on the island after all, and that they had been captured. The captain sent a search party, and eventually the men were located. By then they were in bad shape, but eventually they would go on to recover. Cook's relief at the men being rescued was quickly replaced by astonishment. He just couldn't fathom how the men had become so lost on a flat, treeless island. He concluded that some sailors were simply useless on land. I just want to add here that the fact Cook had found this tiny island in the vastness of the Pacific is almost impossible. James Cook seemed to enjoy luck that no other explorer had ever dreamed of. Time and time again, he managed to find land in the vastness of the oceans, no matter how small it was. Whether it was luck or a sixth sense that he had honed from all his years of exploration, it only fueled the sense of awe from his men. The expedition spent Christmas on Kiritimati, and the men enjoyed a day's leave on the shore. They were free to feast on roasted fish and shark steaks. And then after New Year's Day, they set off again into the unknown, the holds full of turtle meat. For 2 weeks, the expedition pressed deeper into the Pacific. It felt like they would never see land again. Being in the middle of the Pacific Ocean is like being in outer space. Each night, the men slept on the deck of the ships, staring up at the swells of galaxies and the tapestry of stars. However, after 2 weeks, something happened that nobody expected. At first, seaweed was spotted on the water's surface. This was unusual while travelling in the deep ocean. Then a sailor spotted a bird that was known to never fly more than 10 miles away from land. Cook also noted that the abundance of marine life surrounding the ships seemed to increase. This was all an indicator of one thing: land. But how was this possible? No one, and I mean no one, had ever reported land in this area of the Pacific. Cook was not expecting to see land for months until they hit the coast of North America. On every map, there was just thousands of miles of emptiness. Well, on the morning of January 18th, the mystery was revealed. On the horizon emerged a large volcanic mass, an island. Whatever this place was, it was utterly new. The crew erupted with excitement. Through his spyglass, Cook saw fertile valleys, thick forests, and towering mountains. The sight of fresh water in particular lifted the men's spirits. They had been running dangerously low. For the first time in weeks, the men had hope. So what exactly had they found? Well, James Cook had stumbled upon the island of Kauai, part of the Hawaiian archipelago. This was nothing short of monumental. No European had ever set foot in Hawaii before. And there's a reason for that. The Hawaiian Islands are the most isolated chain on Earth, lying thousands of miles from any continent. As the ships closed in, the men buzzed with anticipation. They had discovered a new land, but there was one question on everybody's minds. Was it inhabited? I mean, how could it be? It was a small dot in thousands of miles of ocean. How could humans have reached this place? As they got closer, the question was answered. They spotted cultivated fields and smoke rising from the hills. In places, they saw wooden structures. It wasn't long before they spotted movement along the beach. Natives gathered on the shore, and some launched canoes and headed out towards the two ships. The canoes approached, but kept a wary distance. They were dumbstruck at the two floating vessels. They had never seen anything like it. It was a mass of wood and sail beyond their comprehension. Many of the natives were clearly afraid. They struck hostile poses and shouted war songs. Now, some of the sailors had learned the Tahitian language, and in a vain attempt, they threw some words out to these new people. The results were astonishing. The natives understood and replied in the same tongue. This was staggering. Tahiti was almost 3,000 miles away, and yet these isolated people spoke the same language. Cook was awestruck. He was beginning to understand just how widespread the Polynesian culture was, but he just couldn't understand how it was possible. These people didn't have ships, just simple canoes. How could they traverse such distances on a wild ocean? Well, that is a question I plan on answering in another video. Let's just say that these people, like Cook, were true explorers. And by the way, you can imagine the Hawaiian surprise at hearing these strange men speaking their own language. Let's remember, they had never encountered outsiders. At this first meeting between two different worlds, none of the natives could be enticed to come on board. They were just too afraid. For them, the ships were huge floating labyrinths of wood, impossible to understand. But eventually their curiosity won out, and a few brave men climbed up from the canoes. Cook would later describe the moment, writing, quote, "I never saw Indians so much astonished at the entering of a ship before. Their eyes were continually flying from object to object. The wildness of their looks and actions fully expressed their surprise." End quote. I love that quote. You can fully get a sense of the astonishment of the Hawaiian people. It was as if aliens had come down and landed among them. Some of the Hawaiians even questioned if the English were human at all. They tugged at their clothes and examined their hands and feet, and some stared in confusion at the tricorn hats the sailors wore, convinced that their skulls were deformed into 3 points. When an islander spotted one of the English smoking a pipe, they were shocked. They didn't understand how these pale people breathed fire from their mouths. A young lieutenant named James King led a group of islanders below deck to the armory. There they stood mesmerized, watching the blacksmith work glowing metal into shape. Like so many other people Cook had encountered, the Hawaiians immediately recognized the value of iron. In fact, Cook soon realized it was one of the main reasons that they'd come on board at all. They were even eyeing the iron nails that held the hull of the ship together. At first, the natives seemed almost terrified of giving any offense to these strange newcomers. But the trouble was that the two cultures had utterly different ideas of ownership. You see, in Hawaiian society, stealing wasn't just tolerated, it was often treated as a clever art and a test of skill. At one point on the Discovery, some of the Hawaiians tried to take an iron bracket from a window. Well, the window slammed shut, and in a panic, they quickly dived off the ship. Captain Clerk was amazed at how comfortable they were in the ocean. They were the strongest swimmers he had ever seen. The crew watched women carrying babies, jumping off canoes, and swimming to shore through a strong surf. It was clear that these people had no fear of the water. However, this first encounter with these new islanders would not remain peaceful for long. Later that day, a lieutenant named John Williamson set off in a boat with a handful of Marines to find a place to land and get fresh water. Well, as they approached the beach, many natives gathered around the boat and tried to help steer them through the waves. But Williamson, who was known for being a bit of a bully, and to be honest, universally disliked throughout the crew, misinterpreted their actions as hostile, and for a second he thought he was under attack. In the confusion, he panicked and fired a shot at one of the Hawaiians. The man immediately collapsed into the surf, the water turning red. Shocked at the sound of the gunfire and completely perplexed as to what had killed their friend, the natives quickly recovered the body before fleeing to the shore. Like so many other native people encountered on the voyage, the Hawaiians had no understanding of gunpowder. They didn't realize their companion had been struck by a bullet. They thought he had been killed by some kind of high-powered jet of water. As for John Williamson, throughout the expedition, he had always been present when trouble was afoot. A Marine who was on the boat that day would later describe his judgment here as, quote, a cowardly, dastardly action, end quote. All the other Marines present thought it was just obvious the islanders were trying to be helpful. The next day, Cook was rowed ashore along with a group of Marines. On the beach, he was met by a crowd of hundreds, if not thousands of islanders. What happened next was astonishing. As Cook stepped forward, the entire crowd dropped to their knees and pressed their foreheads into the sand in an act of worship. It seemed that the villagers thought Cook was a god, or at least a very high-ranking chief. Cook felt uncomfortable and tried to bring some of them to their feet, but they would not have it. Only when he had walked far out of sight would the people rise. The reason for this, by the way, was that in their society, an ancient rule called kapo mo meant that high-ranking chiefs had to be given complete respect. Anyone that broke that rule was put to death, often in horrific ways, like being burnt alive in a clay oven. That's why they were so reluctant to even look at Cook. But as he hiked further inland, eventually the captain got those he met to rise to their feet. And almost immediately, bartering began. The Hawaiians eagerly brought forward gifts of food, laying them at Cook's feet. In return, he offered them small clumps of iron he'd ordered the ship's smith to forge. This exchange of food and goods was a way of sealing friendship. It was an encouraging sign that peaceful relations could be established. Cook was deeply impressed by what he saw on Kauai. It was immediately clear that these people had built a flourishing, advanced society. The island was densely populated, and its valleys were alive with activity. Cook was greeted by several figures who seemed to hold a higher status, and they led him up a path into a valley. The deeper they went, the more extraordinary the sights became. Cook saw great fields of crops stretching across the land, and carefully engineered waterways. These were no simple ditches, they were irrigation systems that must have taken immense planning and effort to build. Even as Cook walked deeper into their kingdom, Every villager he met would not look at him and fell upon the floor upon his presence. I think here we should acknowledge the courage of James Cook. He was in a completely unknown land, surrounded by people he had only just met, and he only had a few English companions at his side. If the natives wanted to kill him, he would have had no chance, and yet Cook walked without fear. He didn't place his trust in weapons, but in the belief of human communication and understanding. This is what Cook loved most, to be immersed in a new world, and to soak it all in. What struck him most was the prosperity of the villagers. He saw no signs of poverty. They all appeared healthy and content. He did, however, observe fearsome warriors lingering just out of sight. They carried barbed spears and stone axes, weapons tipped with shark's teeth and shards of coral. Cook marvelled at how they had fashioned such deadly tools from nothing more than stone, shell and bone. He thought to himself that this array of weaponry meant things could not be as peaceful as they first seemed. Eventually, the islanders led Cook back down to the shore, where he rejoined the relative safety of his men. As you can imagine, the sailors on board the Resolution and Discovery were itching to get to shore. Cook had the men checked by the surgeon, and any that showed no signs of sexual disease were granted permission to land. The moment they stepped onto the beach, the Hawaiian women were waiting. By the men's accounts, these women were more beautiful than they could have hoped for. They didn't even seem to want anything in return for their sexual favours. The crew couldn't believe their luck. They had been preparing for the icy north, but now found themselves in paradise. However, their excitement wouldn't last long. The expedition stayed at Kauai for only 2 days. Once fresh water and provisions were brought aboard, Cook gave the order to depart. There were strong winds pressing against the Resolution, driving her to the west. And rather than struggle against the elements, Cook let the ships drift out to sea. The crew knew that they had just stumbled upon a discovery which was so extraordinary it would redraw the maps of the world. Nearly all of them wished they could return to the paradise they had just glimpsed. But Cook was moving on. He made no attempt to turn back or explore any of the other islands, including the great island of Hawaii itself. He had his number one goal in mind and could not afford to be distracted. Ahead lay the coast of North America and the Northwest Passage. The voyage north was rough. For 5 long weeks, the ships had battled through strong winds and dangerous waves. The air grew colder, and the men equipped their wool jackets to fight the chill. They stared at the eastern horizon, waiting for land to show itself, but day after day, there was nothing but empty ocean. Just as the men were expecting to sight America, a storm hit. Fog closed in, and icy rain pounded the ships. Cook and Clerk fought to keep sight of each other, knowing one wrong move could see them torn apart in the storm. Finally, on March 7th, 1778, the fog parted and they caught a glimpse of a snowy land. They had reached the coast of North America, in particular, the Oregon coast. It was a wild-looking place. But try as he might, Cook could not get close enough to land. The sea turned violent, driving the ships nearly 100 miles south. Again and again, he would lose contact with land before fighting his way back in. The weather was just dreadful. The crew even reported the sight of a tornado, and at one point they narrowly avoided striking a reef. No one doubted what such a fate would mean. The truth was, the ships were at breaking point. The masts and sails were battered from the punishment they had endured the last few weeks. The expedition desperately needed to find a safe harbour so they could make repairs. By the way, Cook himself did not comment much on their desperate situation. He merely called the weather unsettled in his diary. He was more annoyed at the delays this was causing them. During this time, Cook sailed too far offshore to notice the mouth of the Columbia River, which is one of America's most significant rivers. This is a mistake that critics would later hold against him, but to be honest, it was probably a good thing he missed it. Had Cook seen it, he almost certainly would have been tempted to explore. The Columbia River, however, runs deep inland, but offers no passage to the Atlantic. And worse, its entrance is known to be very treacherous, having claimed countless of ships over the centuries. If he had tried his luck there, it might have ended in disaster. Besides, Cook also had strict orders. He was to press north before turning into any inlets. Not until he had reached 65 degrees latitude was he to begin his search for a passage. The expedition travelled north for another 22 days before Cook spotted an opening in the coast and headed straight for it. The ships and the crew were both in desperate need of rest, repairs and resupplying. They were now beyond the edges of any known European map. Nobody knew what this land would offer them. As the men headed up the opening in the coast, snow-topped mountains towered over them, and the shoreline was thick with dark forests of cedar and spruce. It wasn't long before they saw canoes heading their way. Whoever lived here was coming out to investigate. These native people who approached looked different to the islanders of the Pacific. They wore animal skins and their faces were painted a dark brown. Many of them were decorated with fish bones hanging from their ears or protruding from their lips. As the canoes closed in, the men could hear the natives shouting what sounded like Nootka, Nootka. Cook assumed this was the name of the place, and so he wrote it down as Nootka Sound, a name that has lasted to this day. However, the word Nootka didn't mean the name of the land at all. In their native language, it simply meant go around, likely a warning or an instruction to keep the ships moving along. These people were actually called the Mawachat, which means the people of the deer. They were skilled hunter-fishermen who had lived in the area for at least 4,000 years. It's thought that the Mawachat may have once glimpsed a Spanish ship far off on the horizon, but they had never truly encountered Europeans until Cook's arrival. This meeting was for both sides something entirely new. From oral traditions passed down through generations, we get a glimpse of what the Mawachat thought of Cook's men at this first meeting. They apparently believed the English were a kind of salmon that had transformed into human beings. The sailors looked so different to them with their pasty white skin. As the sun began to set, a shaman of some kind appeared on the shore and led a ceremony. He sang songs as the native canoes circled the two ships. Cook's men watched closely, never discounting the chance of violence occurring. In response to the native singing, two sailors broke out a pair of French horns and played a soft tune. The Mawachat were completely silent, in absolute awe of the music. And that is how this first meeting ended. The two groups sang each other to sleep. That night, many of the natives slept in their canoes, bobbing up and down, right next to the ships. If you're enjoying this video, please feel free to subscribe or leave a comment. This video took a lot of time, so I'd really appreciate any feedback. Thank you, and let's get back to the story. The next morning, Cook focused on the tasks at hand, repairing the Resolution and the Discovery. What the men found was far worse than expected. Masts were rotten, sails needed mending, and the hulls of both ships were leaking. Cook was angry at the report. He was already behind schedule, and now he realised he'd have to stay in this place for about a month in order to make the ships seaworthy again. Luckily, wood wasn't going to be an issue. Towering spruce and fir trees, some of the best timber on earth, stood tall all around the cove. Men were sent out with axes to begin cutting them down, and the area became a hub of activity. The English were especially struck by the natives' canoes. They were sleek, steady and elegant, and seemed to glide across the water. The Mawachat spent much of their lives in them, fishing, sleeping, even fighting from the canoes if the situation demanded it. They were sturdy enough to brave the open sea, and powerful enough to tow a whale carcass home after the hunt. To Cook's men, the craftsmanship was astonishing. Each canoe was carved from a single great tree. The crew found these natives to be hard bargainers. They knew the value of metal and wanted nothing else. Some of them already possessed knives, and Cook surmised that these people were already part of a trade route that worked its way all the way up from the coast of California, driven by the Spanish. While the Mawachat were metal crazy, Cook's men were just as eager for the goods the natives offered. There were animal skins, thick furs, and large quantities of smoked fish. There was also some darker items like human skulls and severed hands up for grabs. Excuse the pun. These were trophies from a recent battle with another tribe. It was a reminder that no matter how friendly these people seemed, violence was never far away in this land. One item above all others caught the Englishman's attention: the pelts of the sea otter. At the time, this fur was considered among the most valuable in the world. In Asia, it was even called soft gold. The fur was dense, silky, warm, and unlike anything the sailors had seen before. Cook's men bought hundreds of them from the Mawa Chat, and one sailor remarked that the hide of the sea otter is, quote, superior to any that is known, end quote. Some of the crew dreamed of selling them in Europe for a fortune, but just as important was their practical value. With the Arctic voyage ahead, the sailors wanted pelts to keep themselves alive in the freezing north. One man wrote, quote, to us who were bound for the North Pole, they were extremely valuable, and everyone endeavoured to supply himself with some of them, end quote. Now, unfortunately for the sea otter, Cook's visit to this place would spell doom for the species. In the years following the expedition, news spread that the animals could be found here in abundance along the northwest coast. It was not long before American hunters would descend on this land and kill the sea otter by the thousands. The animal didn't stand a chance, as they bred slowly, one pup every year or so. It was not long before they would be pushed to extinction. Anyway, weeks went by as the men made their repairs, and spring slowly took hold in this remote corner of the world. By late April, the ships were nearly ready, and Cook at last felt he could leave the men and explore the area a little. Accompanied by Captain Clerk and a few sailors, the group set off on a small rowing boat to do some exploration. Not before long, they found a remote village that consisted of a few wooden houses. The villagers welcomed the English into their homes and prepared a meal. Cook was touched by their generosity, though he noted in his journal that their dwellings were, quote, filthy as hogsties, end quote. Interestingly, he observed that these people did not seem to engage in any sort of vice. They were, quote, happily ignorant of all modes of intoxication. Their only beverage is pure water, end quote. When they left the village, rather than returning to the ships, the group carried on deeper across the bay. It was a long day, over 30 miles of rowing, but it was a rare break from the grind of ship life. Away from the full weight of command, Cook seemed lighter. One midshipman recalled that Cook, quote, would sometimes relax from his almost constant severity of disposition and condescend now and then to converse familiarly with us, end quote. Now this is kind of interesting. One of the sailors who accompanied Cook that day was a 20-year-old called George Vancouver. He admired Cook deeply and regarded him as a sort of mentor. The wild beauty of this place must have left a lasting impression on the man, as well, 14 years later, Vancouver would return here, this time in command of his own expedition to map the coast in detail. In the end, the largest city on Canada's west coast would bear this young man's name, Vancouver. On April 26, 1778, Cook declared the ships ready and gave the order to depart. They slipped out of the cove, accompanied by Mawachat canoes gliding alongside to bid farewell. Soon the coastline receded, and the ships were once again at the mercy of the open sea. Almost immediately, the weather began to shift. It was as if the gods had waited for them to leave the safety of the cove. The wind picked up, and dark clouds gathered on the horizon. Cook knew he should probably turn around and head back to safety, but he refused. He pressed north, driving the ships further from land and deeper into the darkness. The next day, the storm revealed its full fury. To call it a storm hardly did it justice. The men swore it was more like a hurricane. Through the swirling mist, they glimpsed a monstrous waterspout twisting across the sea, threatening to consume the ship's hull. At times, the visibility was so poor they couldn't see beyond the ship's bow, which terrified everyone. For a time, the storm grew so fierce that even Cook dared not sail. The ships were brought to a standstill as they tried to ride it out. It was then that a problem revealed itself. The Resolution was leaking. A gap had opened along the starboard side, just above the waterline, and seawater was forcing its way in. To the men's astonishment, Cook showed no alarm. Out in a storm, with a damaged ship in uncharted waters, he remained calm and unfazed. The crew had to work buckets and pumps throughout the night to keep the water down. Cook's ability to manage a crisis was one of his defining qualities. His philosophy was simple: make the correction and carry on. He disliked unnecessary fuss, believing that fear only bred more fear. Most of the time, he seemed to be able to sense danger before it struck, which never ceased to amaze the men. One sailor wrote, quote, "When no one else had a suspicion of danger, he often came up on deck and changed the course of the ship because he thought land was near. This was so pronounced, everyone believed he had some secret source of foreshadowing. Such occasions were frequent when he alone was sensible to the existence of land, and he was always right." End quote. The storm raged for 5 days, and many of the sailors were certain they would never see land again. They prayed and clung to whatever they could, and cursed the sea that threatened to swallow them whole. What baffled them most was Cook himself. While the men trembled, he seemed completely unbothered, spending much of the ordeal alone in his cabin, as if he was on another planet. I think we should just take a second to think about how frightening an experience this must be, to be just on a wooden ship out in the wild ocean in the middle of a storm. Death must have felt like it could come at any moment. Again, we just can't really relate to this with how comfortable our modern lives are. Anyway, at last, on April 30th, the winds relented and the sea grew calmer. Exhausted but alive, the expedition had been driven far north. When Cook ordered the ships closer to the Alaskan coast, he was pleased to find that they had made considerable progress. Now I just want to pause for a second so we can talk about this part of the world. The coast of Southeast Alaska is a labyrinth of fords, islands and capes. It's so vast and so intricate that even a lifetime would not be enough to chart it fully. And yet this was precisely the task that was set before Cook. His orders were to investigate any inlet or channel that might lead across the continent, but at the same time, not waste precious weeks on fruitless diversions. It was an impossible task. Every day he was forced to make hard decisions. Should he press into that river mouth, that narrow cove, that just might be the Northwest Passage? Or should he sail past and risk leaving history's greatest discovery unclaimed? The maps in his possessions were of little help. Most were little more than speculation, with some showing Alaska as a great island severed from North America entirely. There was one map in particular that had caught his attention. It was a chart made 40 years earlier from the Danish explorer Vitus Bering. But Bering's expedition had been ravaged by scurvy, with 28 men, including Bering himself, dying before the survivors eventually limped home. The resulting map was riddled with errors and assumptions. Cook found himself constantly holding it up against the coastline, trying to match what he saw with what was drawn, and failing at every turn. More and more, he began to suspect that a bad map was worse than no map at all, for it only confused him more. However, on May 5th, Cook finally saw a landmark he was certain matched the old chart. Rising above the horizon was a colossal snow-covered mountain. This was no ordinary mountain. It was the second tallest in North America and one of the tallest coastal peaks anywhere in the world. For Cook, it was unlike anything he had ever laid his eyes on, dwarfing every summit he had ever seen in the Pacific or Europe. He named the mountain St. Elias, which it is still called to this day. Now, before we move on, I just want to update you on the health of Captain Clerk and also the ship's surgeon, William Anderson, who were both suffering from tuberculosis. And well, things were not good. Anderson was close to death. His body had wasted away to nothing. Since he was a surgeon, he could follow the progress of the disease and knew where it was going to lead. I'll note here that despite his suffering, he remained stoic and did not complain. The men were taken aback by his bravery. Now Clerk was a little better, but only just. He had come to realize he was not going to recover. It was just a matter of time. On May 12th, the two ships entered a vast bay that stretched towards the north. Though Cook was still 5 degrees shy of his goal, the opening was far too promising to pass by. While exploring it would technically be a violation of his instructions, Cook wrote, quote, "I believe that he who learns only how to obey orders can never be a great explorer." End quote. The sight of the bay electrified the crew. It was broad and immense and mysterious. Whispers spread through the men. Could this be it? Could this be the fabled passage? Perhaps at last they had found a gateway that would carry them across the continent and deliver them near home. For days the ships crept forward, the men looking out in anticipation. The whole time, Cook was just trying to make sense of this strange new world. What he had entered, in fact, was Prince William Sound, a vast inlet carved by ice and mountains. The richness of the land and sea stunned the men. Halibut and salmon filled the waters, and ducks, geese, and seabirds crowded the skies, while foxes, wolves, and bears prowled along the shores. And everywhere there was whales, so many that the sea seemed to breathe with them. The men were awed by the scale of it all, a true land of giants. For once the weather cleared, and as the sun broke through, they felt its warmth on their skin. After weeks of hardship, the men had hope. But before he could keep exploring, Cook needed to address the leak in the Resolution. He found a sheltered cove where repairs could be made, and it was there that tragedy struck. A sailor named William Austin was lowering the anchor when his leg became tangled in the rope. In an instant, he was wrenched overboard and dragged to the bottom. Against all odds, he freed himself and managed to claw his way back to the surface before being hauled aboard. He did survive, but his leg was shattered and would never fully heal again. With that grim episode behind them, it was not long before the repairs were completed and they carried on into the Sound. The expedition pressed north until they came to a place where the waters split into two major arms. Cook sent out two groups of men in small boats to explore. The scouts would return later that night, but they didn't bear good news. Neither route looked promising, and Cook had heard enough. He wasn't willing to risk more delays on pursuing this any further. Frustrated at the goose chase he had wasted days on, he decided to turn around and head once again for the open sea. For a week, the ships continued their endless journey along the coast of Alaska. As you can see from this map, Cook had no choice but to travel in a southwest direction. It was frustrating for him, day after day, to find that he simply couldn't go north. The sailing was awful, and the men described the weather as raw, cold, and gloomy. Eventually, the coastline just broke up into a mess of islands. Cook believed that at last he had reached the ragged edge of the continent. In fact, what he had discovered was a vast chain known as the Aleutian Islands, a long, sweeping arc of land that reaches out from the Alaskan mainland. It is a pretty amazing feature of geography. To make matters worse, it was here that a thick fog materialized and made visibility extremely poor. At one point, they nearly smashed themselves to pieces on rocks which were hidden by the mist, and one sailor wrote that they were a matter of minutes from disaster. Now I just want to jump in here and say that I recognize that this part of the journey may be somewhat hard to follow. I'm doing my best, but the reality is that the geography in this part of the world is just chaotic and vast. It truly is a maze, so if it seems confusing for me to describe, I apologize. Imagine what it was like for Cook. Finally, by late June, the expedition broke through the Aleutian Islands and at last entered the Bering Sea, which is nearly 1 million square miles of open water. For the first time in months, Cook was free to travel north and east. Now they could make progress. However, on August 3rd, the voyage suffered a terrible blow. William Anderson, the ship's surgeon, finally succumbed to tuberculosis. He was just 27 years old. Cook mourned the young man and praised his patience and dignity in the face of relentless suffering, writing that he wished, quote, "it had pleased God to spare his life," end quote. For Charles Clerk, the loss cut deeper still. Anderson had been a close friend, and Clerk himself was wasting away with the same disease. He knew his own days were numbered. Anyway, a week later, on August 10th, the fog finally cleared, and the men found themselves on Alaska's most western point, which Cook named the Cape Prince of Wales. From this position, just across 50 miles of ocean, the men could actually see the edge of Asia. Cook was fascinated by this, as he had spent his life mapping the Pacific, but he had never actually set his eyes on Asia. Now at last, it was there, just across the water. He had no orders to go there, and didn't really need to cross. But for that moment, the old spark returned. The explorer in him wanted to set foot in Asia, if only once. As the men approached the land, they could make out a small settlement by the coast. This was a Chukchi village, home to a people who had survived for millennia in Siberia's unforgiving north. They lived by the sea, hunting whales and walrus, and had long resisted Russian attempts at conquest. It's extremely unlikely they would have ever laid their eyes on Europeans. Cook was in good spirits that morning. The sun was shining, the air was clear, and for once the expedition felt more like an adventure than an ordeal. Raising his spyglass, he saw that the Chukchi had already spotted the ships, and women and children were hurrying inland while warriors gathered on the beach. But this was nothing new to Cook. 20 Marines accompanied him ashore, where they met 50 armed Chukchi warriors waiting in animal skins, clutching their bows and spears. There were bodies of freshly slain dogs laying on the sand, which were perhaps an offering to their gods. The atmosphere was tense. The natives were clearly ready to fight. It probably would have been wise for Cook to just back away then and there. There was no need to risk bloodshed. Cook didn't even need to be here. But instead, he chose the opposite path. He told his men to hold back by the boats, and Cook himself walked forward alone, arms outstretched, straight into the crowd of warriors. It was a reckless gamble. The Chukchi could have killed him in an instant. However, they backed away at first, unwilling to let him get too close to them. In the end, the gamble paid off. An elder man stepped forward, studied Cook carefully for a second, and then put his arm on his shoulder. The captain offered the man a necklace of beads and also some tobacco. In return, the Chukchi man gave him some fox skins and walrus tusks. This contact broke the tension, and soon more warriors came forward to trade with the English. It was not long before the atmosphere turned festive. Cook and his men were invited into the village and shown how the Chukchi lived. This is one of the things I take away most from Cook's expeditions. The ability for human beings to understand each other through simple gestures and to make peace. This would be Cook's first and last encounter with the Asian continent, and it had not ended in violence but friendship. After 3 hours ashore of feasting and trading, the sailors returned to the ships with full hearts. Morale was higher than it had been in months. And the following week brought real progress. On August 11th, Cook crossed back from Asia to North America, and that same day the ship sailed beyond the Bering Strait into the Arctic Ocean itself. 3 days later, they crossed the Arctic Circle. Here, in the far north, the summer sun never set. The men felt as though they were sailing across the roof of the world. Cook was now in waters no European ship had ever entered. The sailors were certain the prize was close. Surely, somewhere ahead, a passage would open that would carry them across to Greenland and at last within the reach of home. But then, off in the distance, they spotted something. A faint white gleam on the horizon. Cook knew at once what it meant. He had seen it before, far to the south, near Antarctica. The glint of ice. He had not expected to find it here, not so soon. It made him cautious. Within hours, the horizon seemed to change shape. Ice rose up all around them, stretching as far as the eye could see. A vast frozen wall. Cook stared at it in disbelief. This was supposed to be the best season for northern navigation, yet the ice pack looked impenetrable. The temperature plunged, and the men shivered in soaked clothes, while frost formed on their hair and noses, making every movement a misery. For the first time on this voyage, the crew began to wonder if the Arctic was a step too far for them. Cook pressed northeast, searching desperately for an opening in the pack. On August 18th, the expedition reached 70 degrees north, the farthest they would ever get. The situation was turning dangerous. The ice was drifting towards shore, threatening to trap the ships in the shallows. Cook saw the peril at once, and later wrote, quote, "This is what I most feared. The wind was right in our teeth. It was evident if we remained much longer between the ice and the land, it would force us ashore." End quote. Cook had no choice but to turn around and try to escape the ice as fast as he could. Neither ships had been built to withstand the grinding forces of ice. To be caught meant certain destruction, and to make matters worse, fog closed in once again, and the men could only guess where the ice lay in front of them. By August 21st, the ships had made it safely back into the Chukchi Sea. The men were relieved. It had been a close call, and most captains would have ended the attempt then and there. They had tried and they had failed, and surely it was time to turn for home. But not James Cook. To the surprise of his crew, he ordered the ships west, determined to follow the edge of the ice pack as far as possible. Perhaps, he reasoned, if they could just slip past this barrier, the way north would be open, maybe even all the way across to the pole itself. For days they travelled westward along the shifting floes. Cook was beginning to doubt the old theory that sea ice could not form in the open ocean. As I mentioned at the start of this video, it was a common belief at the time that seawater could not freeze in the deep ocean, and therefore one should technically be able to sail right across the North Pole. Well, let's just say that Cook was beginning to doubt that old theory. An ice pack of this scale could not simply be the frozen discharge of rivers. He had never believed in the theory, and now he cursed those who had pushed it upon him back in England. Anyway, for days the two ships travelled westward along the giant ice pack. Along the way, some of the crew took to hunting walrus as their supplies of salted meat were running low. The men were amazed by the strange beasts. They noted how formidable they were and loyal to one another. Cook would later write, quote, "They gathered in herds of many hundreds upon the ice, huddling one over the other like swine. They defend the young to the very last, whether in the water or on the ice, nor will the young quit the mother though she be dead, so that if you kill the one, you are sure of the other." End quote. That afternoon, the hunters brought down 9 of the creatures, some weighing more than 1,000 pounds. It took a back-breaking effort to tow the carcasses on board and butcher them. And when it came time to eat, many of the sailors were not keen. They were known to be fussy with their food. Cook tried to set the example by taking the first mouthful, but few followed. One sailor, a man named George Gilbert, described it with disgust. Quote, "We let it hang up for one day, that the blood might drain from it. After that, we towed it overboard for 12 hours, then boiled it for 4 hours, and the next day cut it into steaks and fried it. And even then it was too rank, both in smell and taste, to make use of, except with plenty of pepper." End quote. By the end of August, Cook came to a barren spot along the Arctic coast of Russia. He had travelled 400 miles, but once again had come to the end. The ice pack was still there, and it closed in on the shore, just as it had done before. There were gaps here and there in the ice, but to Cook, they looked like death traps. He wrote, quote, "It was a matter of doubt whether a ship could get through it or no, and I had no motive for making the experiment." End quote. He was not reckless enough to try it and risk the lives of his crew. The ice was impenetrable, and they had come as far as they could. You might think at this point the men had come far enough. They had left England 2 years ago and sailed to some of the most remote places on the planet. Surely they would be going home now, right? Well, no. Cook was not going to give up. Instead, his plan was to return to the Pacific through the winter and then head back to Alaska in the spring the following year, when he would have more time to try and make a breakthrough in the north. A part of him thought that it was simply the wrong time of year that had thwarted his attempts so far. But the question was, where to spend the winter? Russia was the closest option, but Cook did not want his men marooned in some frozen Siberian village. It would ruin their morale and sap their strength. It would be better to find a place that could both resupply the ships and do the men some good. After some thought, he announced his decision. They would return to Hawaii, the islands they had stumbled upon by chance earlier in the voyage, and which he had yet not fully explored. The crew were overjoyed with this idea. Why endure another winter in the ice when, with just a little more effort, they could be in paradise? Their only frustration was Cook's insistence to return north the following year. To many, it was madness. Couldn't they just accept defeat? The passage clearly didn't exist. They just wanted to go home. One sailor named John Ledyard later wrote, quote, "We were well convinced already of its non-existence. Cook alone seemed bent upon a second trial." End quote. On August 29th, 1779, Cook turned his ship south and headed to what would be his final stop on this fated voyage. If you're enjoying this video, please feel free to subscribe or leave a comment. This video took a lot of time, so I'd really appreciate any feedback. Thank you, and let's get back to the story. The expedition pushed south for a month without pause, covering over 2,400 miles of open ocean. As the latitude dropped, the temperature rose, and the men felt the Arctic leaving their bones. During this part of the voyage, Cook quietly marked his 50th birthday. By the standards of the day, it was an old age still to be at sea captaining a ship. Yet he pressed on with the same relentless purpose as ever. The journey back to Hawaii itself was largely uneventful, except for one single tragedy. On board the Discovery, a freak gust of wind flung a young Scottish sailor named John Cinch down the main hatchway, killing him instantly. On November 26th, after months of empty ocean, a lookout cried land. Ahead lay the island of Maui, rising up from the sea. It shined emerald green in the sun and looked every bit as inviting as the islands they had first stumbled upon earlier in the voyage. But as Maui drew within reach, Cook ordered the ships to a halt. He had come up with a plan. Rather than land, he intended to stay offshore and let the islanders come to him in their canoes. There were a few reasons for this. Cook feared the spread of sexual disease and wanted to keep a barrier between his men and the women of the islands. He also believed that by staying offshore, he could reduce the risk of theft, incidents that had so often before sparked violence. However, for the crew, this decision was soul-crushing. For months, they had dreamed of stepping ashore into paradise, and now, with it right in their sight, Cook was forbidding them. The disappointment of everyone was palpable. But it was not long before Cook's plan began to work. Soon, native canoes swarmed out from shore, carrying yams, sugarcane, and fresh fish. Everyone was relieved to have fresh food again, and to no longer be subjected to the walrus meat. Cook sailed around the island, continuing his plan, stopping occasionally to trade and chart the coastline. But soon, another larger landmass appeared on the horizon. This was the big island of Hawaii. Its sheer scale immediately drew Cook's attention. The big island is larger than all the other Hawaiian islands combined, and it has several active volcanoes. Its dramatic appearance was irresistible, and Cook immediately left Maui and headed straight for it. Again, his plan was to circumnavigate the island clockwise, trading where needed. But as they passed numerous villages, canoes began swarming out in astonishing numbers. Hundreds of native women, unafraid of the surf, swam towards the ships, attempting anything to get aboard. Cook realized that he just would not be able to keep them out. He wrote, quote, "It was not possible to keep them out of the ship, and no women I ever met with were more ready to bestow their favours." End quote. So on, Cook continued his slow cruise around the island. At first it was 1 week, then 2, and soon it stretched to 3 and 4. The crew stared longingly at the land they passed, thick jungles, thundering waterfalls, but Cook seemed to have no intention of landing. His men felt like prisoners. Without a doubt, some even entertained the dangerous thought of deserting and swimming to shore. At one point, a fierce storm struck, and the Resolution and Discovery were separated for 13 long days, longer than ever before. Both crews feared the worst, thinking the other ship had been lost, but eventually they were reunited. Once together again, Cook recognized the reality. The ships had endured enough. The long days of sailing had taken their toll, and it was finally time to find a safe place to harbour. At last, on January 17th, Cook pulled into a place called Kealakuku Bay. This is a breathtaking place. Volcanic cliffs hundreds of feet high rise up from the sea, forming massive stone walls that almost feel like an arena. The men could instantly tell this was a place of great significance. And they were right. For generations, Kealakuku Bay had been sacred to the Hawaiians. It was where their leaders were buried and was the centre of their religion. As the expedition pulled into the bay, the men were astonished at what they saw. On the shore, thousands of natives, maybe even 10,000, had gathered to welcome them. The men had never seen anything on this scale. It was estimated there was 1,000 canoes bobbing up and down in the bay, moving steadily towards the two ships. Cook wrote, quote, "I have nowhere in this sea seen such a number of people assembled at one place. The shore was covered with people, and hundreds were swimming about the ships like shoals of fish." End quote. The men quickly realized this was not a normal occasion. There was something special in the air. The mood of the natives was intoxicating. They were deliriously happy, singing, dancing, chanting, and beating drums. It had a euphoric religious feel. So many natives tried to climb aboard the Discovery that it began to hill dangerously, threatening to capsize. The atmosphere surged with energy to a level none of the crew had ever witnessed. Through the hordes of people, a special canoe emerged, decorated with ornaments and symbols. On board was an old holy man. With Cook's permission, he stepped onto the Resolution and presented the captain with gifts of food. He held an elegant red cloth, which he draped around Cook like a ceremonial cape. The crew noted the reverence in the man's movements. The old man seemed almost afraid to touch Cook, as if he might be struck down by the gods. He chanted softly under his breath, and the men could feel the sacred weight of the encounter. Now, I'm going to pause here and explain what was happening as much as we can piece together, because I think this is really the most astounding part of this entire voyage. By an incredible twist of fate, the two ships had entered the bay at the height of a festival known as Makahiki. This festival honoured the Hawaiian god known as Lono, who was the deity for peace, rain, and fertility. In Hawaiian belief, it was prophesied that Lono would return to Hawaii, circling the island just as Cook had done in an incredible coincidence. Another similarity was that Lono was associated with a type of shield, and to the Hawaiians, the masts and sails of the ships resembled this emblem. To put it bluntly, the Hawaiians thought that Cook was their god Lono, and he had returned as prophesied. Cook had spent so long circling the island that news of his arrival had spread far and wide. For weeks the Hawaiians had been able to see Cook's strange ship circling their island, and as a result, their excitement had built to an extraordinary level. When Cook finally set foot on land, the crowd fell to their knees and would not look at him. They chanted, "Lono, Lono," repeatedly. A lieutenant who accompanied Cook that day wrote that the people's treatment of him, quote, "seemed to approach adoration," end quote. By the way, I'll point out here that historians debate what the Hawaiians actually believed. Did they truly think Cook was a god? Some argue they may have simply accepted him as someone enacting the role of Lono, a powerful alien figure unlike anything they had seen before. However, the most widely accepted theory is that at least a portion of the people genuinely believed Cook was divine. The diary entries of the crew are consistent with this interpretation. Some critics have also questioned Cook's actions here. He appeared to play along with the notion that he was a god. Perhaps it was out of respect for their customs, or maybe he simply enjoyed this bizarre and incredible experience. Let's also not forget that Cook needed the Hawaiians to like him. After all, he needed their wood, their food, and their water. He couldn't risk offending them. In my opinion, this whole episode is just remarkable. What are the odds that Cook arrived at the height of this festival and had circled the island for weeks? You just can't write this. Anyway, the 2 weeks that followed were among the happiest the crew had experienced on the entire expedition. The Hawaiians welcomed them with generosity, providing abundant food, and the weather was warm and pleasant. Cook was hoping to stay here in Hawaii for the entire winter, and the men were busy making repairs to the ships. However, it was not long before thievery became a concern. The Hawaiians began swimming under the ships, pulling out nails and other metal fittings, so much so that it was feared the ships might come apart. Cook, with the help of some of the local chiefs, had to supervise closely to ensure the ships remained intact while still maintaining good relations. By the way, the locals continued to call Cook Lono and treated him with great respect, although the initial hysteria had begun to subside. That didn't stop them, though, from regarding every member of the crew with astonishment, as if the English were beings from another world. One of the men wrote, quote, "It is very clear that they regard us as a set of beings infinitely their superiors," end quote. As the expedition neared its 3rd week in Hawaii, the mood began to shift. A few chiefs approached Cook, gently asking when they might be leaving. Over the next few days, their hints became less subtle. There were 2 main reasons for this. First, 180 ravenous English sailors were a considerable drain on the island's resources, consuming large quantities of food. Second, and perhaps more importantly, it was a matter of respecting tradition. Cook, or rather Lono, was supposed to know his season and his time. The festival of Lono had ended, and surely the god would understand that he needed to go. Cook sensed the Hawaiians' growing impatience and decided it was time to leave. He didn't want to overstay his welcome. But there was one problem. A member of the crew, William Watman, had died. He had sailed with Cook on his previous expeditions and was well liked by all. Though he had been ill for some time, his passing was felt deeply by the men. Cook requested that Watman be buried beside the Hawaiian chiefs in Kealakuku Bay. Now, I say this was a problem because this event changed how the Hawaiians viewed the English. Cook and his men were not gods, they were mortal. They could die. If Cook or Lono had the power the Hawaiians believed he did, surely he could have prevented his friend's death. They were beginning to realize that maybe Cook wasn't a god at all. But luckily for all, the next morning, February 4th, the ships weighed anchor. It was a moment of relief for both sides. The Hawaiians were glad to see them go, and the English were happy to be away, sensing that relations had begun to strain. Thousands of Hawaiians cheered as the ships slipped away from the island. Now, before heading back to Alaska, Cook planned to chart the Hawaiian Islands, working his way along the west coast. For several days, the ships moved carefully through the sea, mapping and taking bearings. But just as the last island was about to disappear over the horizon, a storm struck. The foremast of the Resolution split under the strength of the gale. It likely had been rotting internally, and no one had noticed. This was a serious problem that demanded immediate attention. There was no way they could continue north to Alaska in this state. Cook was furious. He needed a place with quality wood to repair the mast. He could have risked heading to another island, but in a fateful decision, he decided it was safer to return to Hawaii, hoping the stop would be brief. And well, as soon as they returned to Kealakuku Bay, the Hawaiians treated the English very differently. The atmosphere had shifted. The natives could not understand why Cook or Lono had come back. It was no longer his season, and besides, why was Lono's ship broken? Surely a god would have the power to fix such things. One of the chiefs approached Cook, clearly distressed. An officer described the meeting. He wrote, quote, "He was very inquisitive, as were several of the chiefs, to know the reason of our return, and appeared much dissatisfied," end quote. Theft quickly became a problem again, but on a larger, more serious scale. Where before it had been mischievous, now there was a darker tone. Blacksmithing equipment disappeared on the very first day, and when Cook sent men to retrieve it, they ended up in a fight with some of the Hawaiian warriors. No one was seriously hurt. but the incident could have been disastrous. The situation escalated further on the fourth day when one of Cook's small boats went missing. It was a vital piece of equipment and would be used almost daily in Alaska. The boat had been securely moored to the side of the Resolution, yet overnight someone had cut the rope and taken it. To Cook, this was unforgivable. The boat wasn't just his property, it was the Navy's. And in Alaska, it could mean the difference between life and death for his crew. Cook devised a plan to retrieve it. Teams of men armed with muskets were sent to the nearby villages. They were instructed to impound and arrest any native attempting to use a canoe. If anyone defied them, they had permission to shoot. Cook hoped that this blockade would force the stolen boat to be returned, as he was essentially cutting off the natives' livelihoods. But the captain didn't stop there. On the Resolution, he created an even bolder plan. He decided to pay a visit to the king of the region, a Hawaiian named Kalaniʻopuʻu, whom he had met several times before. Cook intended to greet the king and invite him aboard the ship for a meal. Once the king was on board, Cook decided that he would place him under arrest until the missing boat was returned. In other words, Cook's plan was to kidnap the Hawaiian king. What could possibly go wrong? Now, Cook didn't intend to harm the king, but he believed this plan would ensure the missing boat's swift return. The problem, however, was that the king was the ruler of Hawaii, commanding thousands of seasoned warriors. To his people, he was everything. They would surely not be happy. Anyway, Cook set off to meet the king, accompanied by 9 heavily armed Royal Marines, who were led by an Irish lieutenant named Molesworth Phillips. Cook also deployed 2 small boats lingering just offshore, who were ready to offer support if anything went wrong. One of these boats was piloted by Lieutenant John Williamson, a somewhat troublesome Marine who I have mentioned before in this video. Cook and his men marched into the Royal Hawaiian Village at around 7 a.m, and a servant roused the king from his chambers. He was sleepy from just waking up, but the king, Kalaniʻopuʻu, seemed pleased to see Cook and didn't think anything was out of the ordinary. Cook invited him aboard the Resolution and he accepted. However, as they made their way to the shore, a strange sound began to ripple across the bay, a low, anxious wailing that slowly grew louder. It was as if people were shouting and crying out in grief. The king didn't really seem to notice, but the sound was unsettling, and an omen, perhaps, of what was to come. What had provoked this sound was an incident that had occurred just 30 minutes earlier. One of Cook's teams, who were assigned to enforce the bay's blockade, had shot and killed a native who tried to break through. This was no ordinary villager, it was an important chief. Word of his death spread quickly, and nearby Hawaiian warriors were enraged and eager for vengeance. From the Hawaiians' perspective, the situation looked dire. These strangers had just killed one of their leaders, and now they were attempting to seize their king. It seemed all too possible that Cook might kill him as well. Just as the king was about to step into the small boat that would ferry him to the Resolution, a woman ran to his side and threw herself at his feet. It was one of the king's wives, and she was sobbing uncontrollably as she had heard the news of the chief's death. She pleaded with the king and tried to convince him that he was in mortal danger. Cook was furious at the interruption and tried to encourage the king onto the boat as quickly as possible. But the man was hesitating, confused as to what was going on. And it was that moment that hundreds of Hawaiian warriors spilled onto the beach. They had come to rescue their king. They shouted, waved weapons, and blew horns, calling for reinforcements. The situation, which was already precarious, was quickly moving towards disaster. Phillips, the lieutenant who was accompanying Cook, was only just beginning to grasp the danger of the situation. He asked Cook if he should order the Marines into battle formation on the rocks. Cook nodded, but his attention seemed elsewhere, fixed on the warriors. He was calm, too calm. It was as if Cook did not truly believe these people would dare attack him. He was more annoyed that his plan had failed. In the confusion, the Hawaiian king fled to his nearby warriors and made his way back to the village, leaving Cook standing alone with his marines, facing hundreds of warriors. The events of the day were clearly spiraling out of control, but Cook did not move. He didn't seem to believe that these people would try and hurt him. After all, he was their god, wasn't he? But it was then that reality began to sink in. The Hawaiians were out for blood. A warrior rushed forward towards Cook, with his dagger raised. The captain was finally forced into action. He lowered his double-barreled shotgun and fired. The first barrel, which was loaded only with shot, was not lethal and struck the man without killing him, but it enraged the warriors even further. Their god, Lono, had tried to hurt them. Then a second warrior lunged towards Phillips, and Cook fired the second barrel, which was loaded with real ammunition. The man dropped dead instantly. As far as we know, this was the first person Cook ever killed in his entire life. And the sound of the shotgun firing ignited the scene into violence. The Hawaiians threw stones on the English, and panic spread among the Marines as more warriors poured forward. Cook ordered his men to fire, and a volley rang out, dropping a dozen warriors. The Hawaiians were stunned by the sudden carnage, and for a brief moment stopped in their tracks. Cook shouted for the men to take to the boats. They needed to get out immediately, but strangely, he did not follow his own advice. He stood facing the Hawaiians as if his sheer presence could intimidate them. It is thought that Cook overestimated the psychological impact of gunpowder on the natives. One crew member later wrote, quote, "He too wrongly thought that the flash of a musket would disperse the whole island. Led on by these ideas, he hearkened to no advice, until it was too late." End quote. After the musket fire, the Hawaiians let out a blood-curdling roar. They wanted the English dead. Phillips tried to retreat towards the boat, but he was struck in the head by a stone and stabbed in the shoulder. He turned and fired, killing his attacker, but in the chaos, he lost sight of Cook. The captain was still standing, shouting down at the Hawaiians, utterly exposed. Now, there may be a reason that Cook was reluctant to move towards the small boats, and that is that he couldn't swim. The boats were floating just beyond the surf, and perhaps he thought that the risk of drowning was too great. Whatever the case, we will never know. Now, remember the two boats Cook had deployed to stay just offshore in case they needed help? Well, it was then that Cook turned to them and raised his hand. The men in the first boat, who were led by a man named William Lanyon, interpreted it as a call for help and immediately began firing their muskets. However, the second boat, piloted by the troublesome Marine John Williamson, did nothing. If anything, he ordered them to retreat slightly. Williamson would later claim he thought Cook's signal meant, "Retreat, it's no good here." But I will tell you that after this event, he would be condemned by his peers as a coward. Anyway, back on the beach, the 9 Marines that were under attack were being pelted by rocks relentlessly. They reloaded their muskets as fast as possible, but it was not fast enough. Warriors closed in all around them. A Marine named Tom Fatchett was knocked into the water and beaten to death. A midshipman named James Thomas was stabbed through the abdomen, and others were clubbed to death in the chaos. Lieutenant Phillips scrambled over the rocks in the shallows, desperately trying to reach a boat. A rock smashed into his head, nearly knocking him out, but he summoned every ounce of strength and managed to make it through the surf, fighting the current and the onslaught of attackers. The boat led by William Lanyon had come close enough that a few of the men managed to swim and reach it, but the second boat, led by Williamson, still did nothing. He even ordered his men to put down their oars and wait. I will note here that even the men on his own boat were sickened by his cowardice, and Phillips, seeing this behaviour from the shore, would later say he, quote, "thought of shooting him on the spot," end quote. Now at last, Cook finally began to realise the Hawaiians were not going to stop. He hurried towards the rocks where a boat waited, but he refused to run, perhaps thinking it was beneath him. Several times he battered away Hawaiians trying to grab him. But then he reached the water's edge and had nowhere else to go. That was when a warrior stepped forward with his club raised. For a moment, the Hawaiian hesitated, as if unsure whether he faced a man or a god. According to Hawaiian oral history, the warriors thought, quote, "If he be a god, he will not make a noise. If a man, he will cry like ourselves." End quote. The warrior smashed the club into Cook's head. The captain sank to one knee, groaning, trying to clear his vision. At the sound of his pain, the Hawaiians howled and surged forward. One warrior leapt onto Cook's back, riding him like a wounded animal, and plunged a dagger deep into his neck. The captain struggled, trying to throw the attacker off, but soon collapsed into the water. The men in the boats watched in horror as Cook fell. They were powerless to intervene. Blood mingled with water, and the bodies of both the English and Hawaiians lay across the rocks. 4 Marines were dead, and over 20 Hawaiians had fallen. Finally, news had reached the Resolution, and the cannons were fired. The Hawaiians scattered, afraid of their power. At this moment, it probably would have been possible for the 2 small boats to try and retrieve the bodies, but instead, Williamson did nothing. He ordered his men back to the ship, leaving Cook's body behind. When they reached the Resolution, the crew were in shock. Many wept openly, mourning the loss of Cook, their captain, the man who had led them around the world. One sailor cried out, quote, "Our father, we have lost our father." End quote. Charles Clerk, aboard the Discovery, was about a quarter of a mile away, but he had watched the scene through his spyglass. He couldn't make out every detail, but he understood roughly what had happened. A boat from the Resolution soon reached him and delivered the grim news. Cook was dead. Grief and pain surged through Clerk. He had lost a dear friend, and now he was a leader of the expedition and bore that responsibility. But Clerk acted quickly. He ordered a heavily armed boat to recover the items left on shore. Everyone was to retreat to the ships. Clerk then sent a sailor who was the most fluent in the Polynesian language to negotiate with the Hawaiians and retrieve Cook's body. The negotiator managed to speak to some of the chiefs, but the news wasn't good. Cook's body had been taken far into the hills, and there was little hope of recovering it. However, the next day, a priest approached the Resolution, carrying a wrapped bundle. Clerk took it into his cabin and was horrified to discover a hunk of human tissue the priest claimed was Cook's leg. When asked about the rest of the body, the priest said that Cook's head had been smashed and the remainder of his body burned. Clerk was unsure whether this piece of flesh was truly part of Cook, but he buried it at sea with full ceremony. As you can imagine, most of the crew's grief quickly turned to anger. They wanted vengeance for the man they loved so dearly. Matters were made worse when they saw a native man in a canoe spinning Cook's hat on a stick, taunting them. The men demanded retribution and urged Clerk to act, but he refused. The new captain wanted to avoid further bloodshed and depart this place as quickly as possible. I will note here, however, that not all of the Hawaiians were happy with what had occurred. That evening, 2 young boys swam towards the Discovery, and they sang mournful songs as they floated next to the ships. The men were deeply moved by their singing and invited them on board. The boys were clearly scared, but they accepted, came onto the deck when they sang their songs for the crew, before diving back into the sea when they were finished, disappearing forever. Their courage at coming aboard the ship just to share their songs left a lasting impression on everyone who witnessed it. Unfortunately, the violence was not over. There was to be one final clash. Upon inspection, it was discovered that the water casks on both ships were not nearly as full as first thought. They would need to be refilled before the expedition could set off. Clerk sent out a group of heavily armed men to land and find a nearby stream. The Discovery stayed close to shore, so it could provide fire if needed. As soon as the English landed, the Hawaiians gathered and began harassing them, throwing rocks and stones. A few of the men received injuries, and the English had enough. They had lost friends, they had lost their captain, and their rage was raw. The men went on a rampage, burning huts and shooting anyone they came across. The Hawaiians fought back, but their weapons and armor were no match for the guns. As horrific as this event was, it did work in the expedition's favor. Having now witnessed the full force of the English firepower, the Hawaiians decided to sue for peace. They waved white cloth from the beach and sang songs of friendship. Many of the islanders seemed to regret Cook's death and hoped that he would return, being able to reincarnate himself. As part of the peace deal, the Hawaiians delivered a package wrapped in a beautiful cloak. Inside were the rest of Cook's remains. There was no doubt that these were truly his. On the right hand, they found a scar that everyone recognized. It was the same scar left by the accident he had suffered in Canada that I mentioned at the beginning of this video. A few days later, on February 21st, Cook's funeral was held aboard the Resolution. The foremast had finally been repaired, and the carpenters had built a cask to hold his remains. The flags on both ships were lowered to half-mast, and there was not a dry face anywhere. The crew had lost their commander, and to make matters worse, their new leader, Charles Clerke, was clearly dying as well. His illness was only getting worse, and a heavy gloom settled over the two ships that had come so far from home. When the moment came, and the coffin was lowered into the deep, one sailor wrote, quote, "In every situation, he stood unrivaled and alone. On him all eyes were turned. He was our leading star, which at its setting left us involved in darkness and despair." End quote. Now, with the captain dead, I'm going to round things out by discussing what happened to the rest of the expedition and also the aftermath and legacy of James Cook and this epic voyage. The two ships left the bay on February 23rd, 1779, with a very ill Charles Clerke in command. For 3 weeks, the expedition threaded their way through the Hawaiian Islands, completing some surveying that Cook had been intending to finish. In mid-March, they said goodbye to the islands and headed towards the Arctic once again. As you can imagine, the men were not thrilled with the prospect of returning to the cold. Morale was at an all-time low. In April, they sailed into a depressing Russian outpost, and Clerke became friends with the governor there. He left some copies of the ship's journals with the man, as well as the news of Cook's death. The governor promised to keep the documents safe, but also to try and send a copy across the entire Russian continent to London. It was quite an extraordinary gesture, and as we'll see, it worked. But anyway, in June, after making some repairs, the ships continued north into the Bering Sea, mirroring the path they had taken with Cook. However, it wasn't long before once again the men hit a wall of ice. It was pretty much in the same area that Cook had encountered it. The theory that the ice would not be there during the height of summer was now completely proved wrong. It was time to admit defeat. The search for the Northwest Passage was abandoned. Clerke turned the vessels around and gave the order the men had been waiting for: home. However, in a sad twist of fate, during this period, Clerke's health deteriorated, and he wrote a letter to a friend saying, quote, "The disorder has now so far got the better of me, that I am not able to turn myself in my bed, so that my stay in this world must be of very short duration." End quote. 2 weeks later, Charles Clerke died on board the Resolution. He was just 38 years old. A man named John Gore took command of the Resolution. Under his guidance, the ship sailed southwest along the coast of Japan before eventually reaching the coast of China and resting in the port of Macau. It was there that the crew received some news. The American Revolution was going badly for England, and also France and Spain had declared war on Britain. This meant that the voyage home would only be more dangerous. Anyway, they left Asia and eventually made their way around Cape Town, where they had stopped so long ago. In early August, the two ships were finally approaching England, but they got some bad luck. The winds were fierce, and they were forced to sail around the whole of Ireland and over the top of Scotland before finally reaching London on October 7th, 1780. You can only imagine the men's frustration at being so close to home and being forced to sail around the entire island. But that doesn't matter, because the men had done it. The Resolution had been gone from England for 1,548 days. At the time, it was believed to be the longest exploratory voyage in terms of miles and duration in history. And what's more, not a single man had died from scurvy. Now, the news of Cook's death had actually reached London months earlier. The Russian governor had kept his word. His courier had carried that precious bundle of journals and letters all the way across Siberia, and it arrived while the expedition was still off the coast of China. On January 11th, 1780, a day after the news reached the capital, a newspaper called the London Gazette broke the story. The London elite and people of England were shocked and devastated by the report. It is said that King George III wept when he heard the news of Cook's death. Before we finish, I thought I would let you know what happened to Mai, the Polynesian man brought to England who travelled around the world. Well, we don't know for sure. There are many stories about what happened to Mai after Cook left him, but few are reliable. What we know comes down to us through oral history, later European explorers, and missionaries who arrived to convert the natives to Christianity. Most of the stories agree that Mai met a tragic end. Only a few years after Cook's departure, he seemed to have died from a virus that was probably introduced by a visiting Spanish ship. It is said that he had no children, and his house that Cook built on the beach was soon looted and dismantled. However, it is said that Mai took part in a fight between the people of his homeland and a neighbouring island. By all accounts, Mai fought bravely and managed to use his muskets and ammunition to win the day for his people. He got his moment of glory. And what of the ships? Well, historians believe that the Resolution was captured by the French just a year after her return home, and eventually she became a whaler. And this is a fun fact. In 1971, a sliver of oak taken from the ship went to the moon and back with NASA's Apollo 15 mission. That's pretty cool. The Discovery met a less glamorous fate. It was sold after the expedition and was later used for transporting prison inmates. Eventually, it was left to rot, with the memories of the Great Voyage left in the past. And what about Cook himself? Well, the captain's legacy is undeniable. He is without doubt one of the greatest explorers in human history. There are few people that did more to reveal the geography of the planet we live on. In 1874, England purchased a small plot of land at the place where Cook died. On it today stands a simple white obelisk marking the place where he fell. You can actually go and see it if you want to. It sits there alone, overlooking the same waters where Cook met his end. And with that, this great voyage comes to a close. I really hope you enjoyed this video. It's been a lot of work, but I've had a blast doing it. I think these stories give us a perspective of what's possible to endure and achieve. So thank you, please subscribe if you want more, and I hope you are well wherever you are. Goodbye for now.